Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Good evening. My name is Nathan, and I just turned 35. I thought long and hard before writing down what I'm about to share. But I feel an overwhelming need to get everything off my chest. My past wasn't simple. I grew up in a house where the days seemed longer than they actually were. And for many years, I thought those problems would never end. Even though decades have passed, some memories remain vivid in my mind. I'll try to be as faithful as possible to the reality I lived, though I recognize some details might sound unbelievable. Even so, I ask you to believe me. Everything I narrate here is exactly as I remember it. The beginning of it all goes back to my childhood. I must have been 6 or 7 when I realized my father, Richard, wasn't like the other fathers I saw around. Almost every time I returned from school, I'd find my mother, Eleanor, hunched over the kitchen table, scribbling calculations or searching for loose change to pay for the month's basic expenses. My father would stumble in at night, sometimes not even remembering what had happened hours before. "Where's your mother, Nathan?" he would ask, his words slurred. I'd hide behind a wall or piece of furniture, fearing he might lose his temper. It didn't always escalate to something serious, but that atmosphere left me perpetually anxious. Some days, Richard was capable of embracing me like he was the best father in the world. On others, the smallest contradiction would make him explode into shouts that reverberated throughout our small lakeside house. My mother was responsible for keeping everything together. She worked all day at a modest insurance office and took extra shifts at night to try to increase our income. What she earned barely covered the basic bills. Still, she never complained in front of me. The only thing I noticed was her tired, almost lusterless gaze when she picked me up from school or put me to bed. "You're strong, my little man," she would say, kissing my forehead. "This difficult time will pass." I believed her, though I had no idea when it would happen. As time went on, I discovered that to survive the chaos, I needed to keep everything to myself. Speaking openly seemed dangerous. If I told anyone what was happening at home, my father might become even more irritated. I studied until 5th or 6th grade without major problems. I had some concentration difficulties, but put in the effort. It wasn't so much for the studies themselves, but from fear of being hit when the grades came in. At the end of each quarter, my mother would urge me, "Nathan, you have to do your best. We can't lose your scholarship. We can't create more problems." She didn't speak in a threatening tone, but I felt the weight of her words. Richard, on the other hand, showed no concern about my grades, as long as they didn't become a reason for an argument. What truly bothered him was running out of money for alcohol or the other substances he used. The result of all this was that I lived in a state of permanent tension. At 12, I had my first contact with a friend who showed me life could be different. His name was Marcus, and we met at school when the English teacher paired us for a group project. I remember the day I went to his house to write the assignment. I was amazed at the silence and harmony of the place. "Would you like a snack, Nathan?" asked his mother, Valerie. I accepted, somewhat embarrassed. It was the first time I had sat in a kitchen where there were no shouts or tension. They talked and laughed, commenting on their day at school or work. They weren't a wealthy family, but everything there seemed balanced. In that instant, I envied Marcus for having parents who spoke calmly, and for not having to walk on eggshells all the time. As the months passed, I grew closer to Marcus. Many times, I delayed going home after school, preferring to spend time playing video games with him, laughing at silly things, talking about action movies or rock bands we liked. His mother, Valerie, always created an atmosphere of warmth. She would ask if I was okay, if I needed help with homework, and occasionally offered me a cup of hot chocolate. I wasn't used to such kindness. During this time, my mother appeared increasingly exhausted. Richard, my father, seemed to have fallen into a bottomless pit. The expenses for prescription medications to try to balance his anxiety and depression, combined with the alcohol and drugs he wouldn't give up, plunged us deeper into debt. Frequently, shouting would take over the house at night. I tried to hide in my room, but there was one day when the situation went beyond the limit. I was about 13 when I heard something breaking in the living room. I ran out to see what it was and found my mother in tears, trying to dodge a Richard who was beside himself, threatening to break anything within his reach. He was possessed by a rage I had never seen before. "You're just keeping me away from my own son," he shouted, even though in reality he was the one who never sought us out. My mother made a decision. "Pack your things, Nathan. We're leaving here tomorrow at dawn." Those words frightened me, but also brought a breath of hope. We spent that night awake, packing suitcases with clothes and a few belongings. We didn't have much, which made everything simpler. I didn't understand exactly where we were going, only knew it was a place where my Aunt Sarah lived, about 5 or 6 hours away by train. When the sun began to rise, my mother paid for a car that took us to the train station. There were no goodbyes with Richard. He was either asleep or perhaps not even there anymore. The journey was strange. Seeing my mother's face calm, but with immense sadness, touched me. She held my hand as if I were a small child, though I was already a teenager. We arrived at our destination in the early afternoon. Aunt Sarah lived in a simple but welcoming area, a place without tall buildings, with quiet streets. Her house was small but well kept. When she opened the door, I felt the fresh breeze of the place. "You can settle in the back room, Nathan. Make yourself at home," she said, offering a sincere smile. I don't remember having rested so well in the days that followed. Being away from all that chaos made a difference. However, I still had nightmares about my father. I would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, imagining he might appear at the door and start shouting. My mother also took time to adjust to the new routine. She worked in any job that came up, from cleaning to caring for elderly neighbors. My academic life changed. I was enrolled in a neighborhood school where the classes were smaller, and the teachers seemed interested in us. It was there that I met Travis, a quiet boy but very good at sports, especially basketball. "Come play with us after school, Nathan," he said one Thursday. I accepted. I needed to socialize and leave behind the climate of tension I carried. Surprisingly, I enjoyed staying there after classes, shooting hoops on the court. Little by little, I made friends. It was a breathing period for me, despite still feeling an anxiety I couldn't explain. Things really started to improve. I brought home satisfactory grades. My mother was managing to pay the bills without major struggles, and Aunt Sarah supported us as much as she could. There were moments of genuine happiness, something I hadn't felt since early childhood. But then, one Sunday, a phone call brought everything back to the surface. My mother was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she answered her cell phone. She turned pale, rested her elbow on the counter, and gave me a frightened look. "What happened?" I asked, approaching her. She tried to hold back tears. "Your father, Richard. He passed away. It was a heart attack." I stood in silence. It was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, anger, and sadness all at once. Even having been an absent and aggressive father, he was still my father. The news shook me more than I expected. We went to the funeral in another town, where Richard had relatives we barely knew. The ceremony was quick and discreet. My mother cried silently, holding my hand. I couldn't shed a single tear, but my chest hurt as if something had been forcibly torn out. After the funeral, a decision came that caught me completely off guard. "Nathan, we're going back to where we used to live," my mother said firmly. I was stunned. But why? That place was the scene of so many bad things. "It doesn't make sense." She looked at me with a determined expression. "I need to resolve pending matters. I want us to face the ghosts of the past so we can truly move forward." I didn't know if that made any sense, but I agreed. Perhaps it was a way to close that cycle once and for all. We packed our things again, and soon we were at the train station, ready to face a place I never thought I'd see again. Since it had been more than 4 years since we left in a hurry, I feared what I might find. We went straight to the house where we used to live, which remained closed, without electricity. It was strange to feel that sensation of passing through the same door. But upon entering, I realized I no longer felt the same fear as before. The walls seemed smaller, the damp stains in the corners revealing the abandonment. My mother planned to sell the house, but we needed to arrange documents and clean everything. Meanwhile, we stayed in a small improvised room in a part of the house that was still usable. Despite the discomfort, I felt an involuntary curiosity to revisit my old neighborhood, the streets I used to walk on. One day, while walking there, I almost bumped into a much taller guy wearing a cap. When I looked closer, it was Marcus, my old childhood friend. "Damn, Nathan, is that you?" He hugged me and started talking about 1,000 things at once. We went to have a soda at a nearby store, trying to update each other on our lives over these last few years. He still lived in the same house, but commented that things had changed a lot there. My sisters left to study in another region, and my dad changed jobs. "The house feels emptier," he said. I was happy to find him, but something in his expression made me suspicious that there was something left unsaid. Still, I didn't press him. We arranged to meet again the following week. Marcus insisted that I visit his house. "My mom would love to see you. You remember how much she enjoyed having you over, right?" I remembered very well. Valerie was almost like a second mother to me when I was younger. So I went one late afternoon, without imagining what awaited me. The house had undergone a renovation. It looked nicer. Valerie greeted me with a smile, but there was an odd tone in her gaze. It seemed like she was trying to disguise some tension. "It's good that you came back, Nathan. I was just talking about you with Marcus the other day." The kitchen, where we used to have snacks, was still welcoming, but I noticed the greater silence. Gary, Marcus's father, wasn't around. I asked about him, and Valerie replied, "He's traveling for work. He'll be away for a while." We chatted for a bit, remembering old stories. She asked questions about how my years away had been. At certain moments, she stared at me in a way that left me not knowing where to put my hands. I thought it might just be curiosity, because I had disappeared for so long. Marcus prepared some snacks, put on a game on TV, and even invited me for a video game match. Everything seemed normal, but deep down, I noticed his mother observing me out of the corner of her eye. As the days passed, reconnecting with Marcus became a pleasant routine. We started frequenting a simple club in the region where we played ball with other acquaintances. It was as if we were trying to recapture our teenage friendship. However, Valerie always appeared with some excuse to strike up a conversation with me. "I need help cleaning out the toolbox," or "Can you change a light bulb here for me?" And I, somewhat awkwardly, would end up giving in. At the same time, I felt something I couldn't explain. There was a growing discomfort in her presence. One afternoon, Marcus went out to take care of something downtown and left me at home with Valerie. I was sitting in the living room reading a brochure she had about supermarket sales when I heard footsteps behind me. She placed her hands on my shoulders and said, "You've really grown up, Nathan. It's like you've become a completely different person." I felt my heart race. I didn't know how to respond. Valerie gave a little laugh and returned to the kitchen. It was a simple gesture, but it felt too intimate. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing. In the following days, a rather confusing period began. I had nightmares in the middle of the night. I would remember my father shouting, and then dream of Valerie's serious face. I would wake up startled, not knowing what it meant. My mother noticed I was quieter. "Is everything okay, son?" she would ask. I would change the subject. "I'm just worried about how long it will take to sell the house and move for good." She accepted my explanation, but I had the feeling she didn't completely believe it. Then something happened that I consider the turning point. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus was participating in a soccer tournament. He warned me he would be gone for several hours. I planned to stay home, but Valerie called me, asking for help with a supermarket delivery since she didn't have a car. She said she would walk back and needed someone to carry the bags. I thought it was normal and went, but the situation took a strange turn when we arrived at her house. Valerie locked the door and began putting the groceries in the kitchen. Then, without warning, she turned to me. "You're not going to leave again, are you? Now that you're back, I don't want you to leave me like before." That caught me completely by surprise. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." We drifted apart because my mother needed to leave town. It wasn't something I planned. She approached, lightly touching my arm. "It's just that back then I missed you. You were almost part of the family." The way she said this caused me tremendous discomfort. I tried to end the conversation, saying it was late and that I needed to go home. Valerie, however, took a step forward and held my wrist firmly. "Don't go yet. Stay a little longer. I looked at her hand, which was now trembling slightly. Valerie, She averted her gaze to the corner of the kitchen, releasing my wrist. She seemed embarrassed or regretful, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, she murmured before letting me go. I left as quickly as I could, without looking back. During the night, I could barely close my eyes. My mother noticed my nervousness, but made no attempt to ask what had happened. What could I say? My best friend's mother is acting strange with me. It seemed absurd. The next morning, Marcus sent me a message asking if I wanted to watch a movie at his house. I made up an excuse, saying I had a commitment. I spent the day locked in my room, rereading some old books and trying to push away the memories of Valerie's face approaching me. My contact with Marcus decreased significantly after that. I could no longer feel comfortable in his house. I hated the idea of encountering Valerie in the hallways. I spent more time wandering the streets of the neighborhood, returning home only at night. My mother, suspicious, bombarded me with questions, but I always gave short, vague answers. You didn't used to disappear like this when you were younger. Mom, I'm just walking around, thinking about what we'll do when we sell the house. She would nod, but I felt I wasn't being transparent. The weeks dragged on until one day, as I was returning from the bakery, Marcus appeared by my side. We need to talk, man. What's going on? Why did you disappear? He spoke with a tone of hurt. I tried to stay calm. It's nothing personal. I just have a lot on my mind. Did my mom do something to you? He asked unexpectedly. My reaction must have given me away, because at that very moment, he lowered his eyes and shook his head, as if he already knew the answer. You're not the first to tell me she's been acting strange. I'm sorry if she put you in an uncomfortable situation. I didn't know how to react. Marcus continued. She's been into these ideas about charms and other weird practices. Would you believe she's always looking for people who claim to work with energies and that kind of thing? My curiosity was piqued. What do you mean? What exactly does she do? I'm not entirely sure. Sometimes I find candles lit in her room, cloths with herbs hanging behind doors. I think she's messing with something I don't fully understand. I swallowed hard. Perhaps there was a connection between that behavior and the way Valerie had been treating me. Have you ever asked her directly what she's doing? I tried, but she got irritated and said I was meddling in things that weren't my business. This conversation left me even more uneasy. I remembered how welcoming Valerie had been in my childhood, but now she seemed like a person full of secrets. Moreover, there was something in that exchange of glances between us that wasn't normal. Marcus continued talking. She mentions your name sometimes. I've heard her say something about you coming back to stay. It's bizarre, Marcus, he agreed, not knowing what to do. We decided he would try to better understand what was happening. In the following days, I entered a cycle of insomnia. My mother caught me in the kitchen at dawn, staring at the sink. Nathan, are you going through something? I shook my head, not having the courage to tell the truth. I was afraid of making her even more worried. After all, it was my mother who supported everything, and also lived with the stress of resolving the bureaucracy of selling the house. I ended up saying it was just a phase that would pass. She hugged me, sighing, I need you to be honest with me, but if you don't want to talk now, that's okay. I'm here Valerie's actions took an even more forceful turn. She began sending me messages on my cell phone for no apparent reason. They were short texts asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, and sometimes saying things like, "You're not like the others. I feel there's something special about you." This gave me chills. As much as I didn't want to be overly dramatic, the way she addressed me seemed inappropriate and confusing. I tried not to respond, but at times I felt coerced into at least being polite. It was on a Saturday night that everything changed. My mother had gone out to resolve an issue with documents, and Aunt Sarah had traveled to visit some relatives. I was alone at home, in the living room watching television, when I heard knocks on the door. Upon opening it, I came face to face with Valerie, sweaty and breathless. "I need to talk to you, Nathan. It's urgent." My first impulse was to refuse, but she insisted, saying it couldn't wait. I invited her in, though reluctantly. She sat on the couch, without letting go of the purse she carried, and began talking rapidly. "You must think I'm going crazy or something, but I need you to understand my situation." I remained standing at a considerable distance. "Look, Valerie, I think it's better if you talk to Marcus. He's worried about you." She interrupted me, agitated. "I don't want to involve my son in this. I know what he thinks, but it's not that simple." "Then what do you want from me?" She took a deep breath, staring at the floor. "A few weeks ago, I discovered something about you, something I felt when you were younger." From there, Valerie launched into talking about a type of belief that mixed charms, rituals, and an idea of soul connection. According to her, since I had appeared at her house in my childhood, she had felt an uncommon connection. I found it very strange, but tried to stay calm. "I don't know where you got this from, but I don't want to be involved in anything like that, Valerie." She nodded her head, taking out a small wooden box from her purse that looked quite old. "In here are things I've collected to strengthen this connection, objects of yours that I've kept over the years." I felt a shiver run through my body. It was strange to imagine she had kept things of mine, without my knowledge. Perhaps she had collected scraps from places where I left papers or pieces of fabric, without my noticing. "I know it's hard to understand," said Valerie, opening the box, "but I need you to trust me." Inside was an old keychain with my name, a piece of a shirt I didn't even remember wearing, and most disturbingly, a small photo of me, apparently cut out from some family image. How did you get this?" I questioned, stunned. Valerie didn't respond directly. She remained silent for a few seconds, then looked at me again. "When you returned to town, I felt that this bond intensified. I tried to approach you calmly, but you kept avoiding me. What I wanted was to send her away right then, but I was paralyzed. I couldn't understand how someone who had been so kind to me, when I was little, now spoke of something almost obsessive. Valerie, there is no bond. You need help." She closed the box with a frustrated expression. "Maybe it's you who doesn't understand." She got up from the couch and took a few steps toward the door, but stopped before leaving, looking at me with a tense face. "I'll leave for now, but don't think you can escape this bond." I was speechless when she finally left. I closed the door and nearly collapsed on the floor. My heart was racing, my hands were trembling. I remained motionless for a few minutes, digesting that absurd conversation. In the following week, I didn't sleep properly on any day. I went back to having nightmares involving my father mixed with the figure of Valerie, as if she were always lurking in my thoughts. One morning, my mother noticed I was exhausted. "Nathan, you have enormous dark circles under your eyes. What's happening?" This time I decided to open up, at least in part. I told her that Marcus's mother was making me uncomfortable, and I wanted distance. I didn't delve into the details of rituals or soul connections, because it sounded too unbelievable. My mother opened her purse and took out a piece of paper. "If things are going at this level, perhaps you should talk to a family friend of ours. He lives around here. They call him Mr. Thompson. He's a gentleman who has helped other people with advice. He understands ancient beliefs, you know." I blinked, not quite understanding. "What do you mean?" "You want me to talk to someone who deals with prayers and that sort of thing?" "It's not exactly that. He has knowledge about situations that are out of the ordinary. Maybe he can guide you." At first, I thought it was a waste of time, but after the bizarre conversation I had with Valerie, I decided to try. I called the number my mother had written down, and a hoarse voice answered. I explained that I needed help, although I wasn't sure how to describe the problem. The voice told me to come by the next afternoon. When I arrived, I encountered a simple house surrounded by a yard full of plants. I rang the doorbell, and an elderly man with dark skin and white hair, wearing a worn shirt, came to receive me. "Are you Nathan?" he asked, analyzing me from head to toe. "Yes, are you Mr. Thompson?" He gestured for me to enter. His living room was modest, with some wooden chairs and a small altar in the corner where there were images I didn't recognize. I sat in front of him and gradually began to tell the story. With my father, my escape to another region, the return after 4 years, and finally Valerie's recent behavior. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but with each detail, he remained silent, just nodding his head as if everything made sense. "So she says she formed a bond with you," he repeated after I had spoken. "And you feel that somehow she's trying to control you?" I nodded. "I don't know if it's control or something similar, but I feel watched." He cleared his throat. "These things sometimes arise from obsessions. It's not necessarily a supernatural power, but the strength of belief can affect our psychology in an intense way." Mr. Thompson explained that in many cases, rituals and charms function as triggers in the mind of the target, even if there is no real power involved. The simple fact that the person believes in that influence can cause a feeling of imprisonment. You need to maintain your mental clarity, young man. If she finds gaps in your fears, she can take advantage of that. He suggested I participate in a kind of protection ceremony, something that, according to him, would help reinforce my conviction that this bond was merely an obsessive construction on her part. On the agreed day, I returned to Mr. Thompson's house. He handed me a small cord with an amulet. "Wear this for a while. It's not that it will work like a miracle, but it can remind you that you're not alone and that what she tries to impose has no real power." I was a bit skeptical, but at that point, anything that would help me deal with the fear would be welcome. He also gave me some instructions. Avoid direct contact. If she insists, leave the location. Don't accept objects or food from her, and above all, trust in your ability to say no. I returned home feeling a little stronger, albeit still insecure. For a few days, Valerie didn't appear, and I resumed my routine. I began helping my mother finalize the last adjustments to sell the house. I even thought Valerie might have given up, or that I was exaggerating. However, one afternoon as I was leaving a small grocery store, she appeared behind me. "Nathan, we need to talk." I didn't turn around. I continued on my way. She insisted, holding my arm lightly, but I broke free. Enough, I left without saying anything else, my heart racing. I remembered Mr. Thompson's words. I felt that each time I avoided her, she became more irritated. One night, Marcus showed up at our house, apologizing for everything. "My parents are separating. My dad discovered these oddities of my mother." His eyes were sad. He looked at the ground. "I'm really sorry if this affected you. I swear I didn't want our friendship to end. You have nothing to apologize for, Marcus. You didn't do anything." He took a deep breath, seeming relieved that I didn't blame him. "I'm moving to my aunt's house. I can't stay there anymore." I felt sorry for him, but knew it was the right decision for him to protect himself as well. After that, I tried to maintain minimal contact with Valerie. But a month later, she knocked on our door again. I was in the yard playing with Aunt Sarah's cat. My mother was the one who answered. I heard their voices raising in tone and ran to see what was happening. "How dare you?" my mother was saying, holding the door. "Do you really think you can come here demanding anything?" Valerie replied, pointing her finger, "Nathan will listen to me, whether he wants to or not. He knows about the connection." My mother gave an indignant look, but I signaled for her not to react too harshly. She was already threatening to call a neighbor to help remove her. But I preferred to intervene before things got worse. Valerie burst into the living room, opened that wooden box again, and this time took out a piece of yellowed paper full of scribbles that looked like prayers or symbols that made no sense to me. "With this, I can ensure you'll stay by my side," she said, almost in a threatening tone. I stood before her, raising my voice for the first time. "You don't have that power over me, and there's nothing I want from you. This ends here." My mother approached, holding my shoulder. Valerie took a step back, trembling. "You still don't understand. This ritual began many years ago." At that moment, I felt the pulse in my neck. I remembered everything Mr. Thompson had said about faith in one's own freedom, about not giving in to fear. "You're confused, Valerie. There is no bond except what you've invented in your head." She opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. She lowered her head, and I noticed her hands closed around the paper. For a moment, I thought she might tear it up, but she put it back in the box, and without looking at anyone, turned toward the door. "One day you'll admit it," she said before leaving. When the door closed, I collapsed on the couch, feeling the tension evaporate. My mother sat beside me, hugging me around the shoulders. "Are you okay?" "I think so," I replied, exhausted. "I just need this to stop happening once and for all." The next day, I told everything to Mr. Thompson, including this last confrontation. He listened to me, slowly stroking his white beard, and said that the fundamental thing was for me to keep my head firm, never believing she could control me. "If you believe she can't, then she can't," he repeated. After a few more weeks, the house was finally sold. My mother packed the bags, and Aunt Sarah accompanied us. I felt we needed to leave that place for good, without looking back. we received news from Marcus, telling us he was living with his aunt and had no plans to return, at least not at that moment. As for Valerie, neighborhood gossip said she continued living alone, increasingly isolated. I don't know if she sought any kind of professional or spiritual help. Personally, I just wanted to stay away from any memory that connected me to that torment. We went to another county, unknown to most, and there I began a technical course. My mother, free from legal issues, entered a steady job. It seemed like another fresh start, but different from the previous one. Now, without my father's shadow and without Valerie's obsessive presence. Although the tranquility was welcome, I carried the emotional scars. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what the hell had happened, not knowing if it was the product of her mental imbalance or if there was something more. Years passed and many things changed. I met an incredible person, Rebecca, whom I married. We had a son, William, and each time I look at him, I promise myself that I will never let my boy grow up in the climate of tension I lived in for so long. I thought I had overcome everything: the troubled childhood, the loss of my father, and Valerie's obsession. However, one day, revisiting my social networks, I found a friend request with a name that was frighteningly familiar. Valerie. My heart stopped for an instant. I clicked on the profile, and the photo was definitely her. I felt my stomach turn. She had found me after so many years. My first reaction was to want to decline, block, delete that request. But I stood for a few seconds, not knowing if I was ready to deal with the possibility of her reappearing in my life. Rebecca came into the living room, holding William, who was asking for attention. It was then that I realized how much I had to lose if I allowed the past to reopen wounds. I closed the browser and blocked her profile without hesitation. "Any problem?" asked Rebecca, noticing my expression. "Nothing important, just something that doesn't interest me anymore." She gave me an affectionate look and returned to the kitchen. That day, I understood that the main battle I fought wasn't against Valerie or against my father's madness, but against my own fears, against the feeling that I was trapped in events I couldn't control. Mr. Thompson was right. Sometimes the strength of a supposed curse or bond lies in our belief that we are vulnerable. I stopped believing in that, and that dependency broke. Today, I still keep the memories of everything I lived through, but I've learned not to let them suffocate me. I prefer to think that I am the product of the good things that happened to me amid so much chaos. My mother remains strong after everything, and I feel grateful that we have finally found peace. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Marcus. I was born in a small town on the outskirts of Seattle, in a modest house where money was always tight. I grew up watching my parents struggle every day to secure the basics: electricity, water, food, and minimal comfort. I never experienced luxury or had breathing room at the end of the month, but I clung to the hope of a future where I could offer something better for my family. Over time, what began as a childish desire to have a more comfortable life evolved into the primary goal of my adult years. When I turned 23, I decided to relocate to a more central part of the city where jobs were opening up at a tech distribution warehouse. The idea was simple: work, save what I could, and try to establish some stability. I owned an old car bought with help from my uncle, who lent me part of the money. It constantly gave me problems, but allowed me to commute to work and back home without relying on overcrowded buses. I didn't want to repeat the insecurities of my childhood, so I devoted myself to my job, sometimes taking overtime shifts. My girlfriend Layla lived a similar routine, working at a convenience store downtown. We shared the dream of building something solid, a home where essentials wouldn't be lacking. Eventually, Layla and I decided to get married. We were already living together in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with a kitchenette combined with the living area and a minuscule bathroom. Honestly, it was cramped, but it served its purpose. It was close to her workplace, and I could drive to the warehouse where I worked the afternoon shift and occasionally part of the night. Still, bills started to tighten their grip. Rent increased almost every year. The electricity bill climbed without warning, and groceries never got cheaper. Each month, we knew money would stretch to the limit, with practically nothing left for emergencies. I wanted a child, she did too. But whenever we looked at our expense spreadsheet, we felt discouraged. A baby meant diapers, medical checkups, medicine, and tiny clothes. It also meant time off work for childcare, which would force us to reduce our working hours. It was a dream constantly postponed, waiting for a perfect moment that never arrived. Around my 26th birthday, I noticed my increasingly aging car was giving me more expense than service. In and out of repair shops, breaking parts, oil leaks. A considerable portion of my salary went into maintaining that precarious vehicle. On the other hand, I knew that if I managed to trade it for a less worn-out model, I could work as a rideshare driver during hours when I wasn't at the distribution center. Some acquaintances did this, and while it wasn't a fortune, it provided a good supplement at the end of the month. I mentioned this idea to Layla one night as we ate rice and beans with some cheap cut of meat. "Do you really think you can handle working all day at the warehouse and then driving until the early morning?" she asked. I wasn't even sure myself. I knew it would be exhausting, but I was convinced it was the only way out to have more financial flexibility and perhaps plan for a baby with less fear. I managed to sell my old car within a few weeks and used the money as a down payment on a pre-owned vehicle, already planning to register with the rideshare app. At first, everything was new and exciting. I worked my normal shift at the distribution center until 5 in the afternoon, and from 6 until around 11 at night or midnight. I drove around the city accepting ride requests. The next day, I would wake up early for the morning shift, sometimes managing to switch to the afternoon one depending on the supervisor, but almost always without proper rest. I took quick naps in the car and even received several warnings at work for my decreased productivity, but I remained determined. I arrived home exhausted, with pain in my arms and legs, only wanting a shower and bed. Layla was concerned, but simultaneously approved of the fact that we could finally pay some bills without having to split everything on the credit card. We noticed a small relief with the rent. I managed to pay the monthly installment on time without that tension of, will we be late or not? There were also the electricity and water bills, now more manageable. It wasn't an ideal situation, but compared to previous months, we could breathe a little easier. Even so, our married life began to suffer. Rest hours disappeared. Our conversations were reduced to good morning, goodbye, good luck at work. And at night, I often came home late, finding Layla already asleep on the couch with the TV on and a plate of food that had gone cold beside her. One night, as I parked the car in the small yard that served as the collective garage of the building, I heard someone call my name. It was Melanie, a neighbor who lived on the floor above us. I knew her by sight and knew she lived with a young daughter and a baby of a few months. I never saw the children's father around. She worked at a night shift grocery store in another part of the city. She explained that because of the distance and the hour, it was expensive to take the bus or a taxi every night. There was only one bus line that passed near our building after 10, but she felt unsafe returning so late, and when it rained, it was even worse. She asked if I would agree to give her regular rides in exchange for a monthly fee. The proposal was simple. She would pay a fixed amount, and I would pick her up at the end of her shift to bring her back, since I was driving around the city anyway until around midnight. I'll take a few extra trips, but I'll have steady money coming in each month. This way I won't be driving around aimlessly, I reasoned. Layla agreed, but asked me not to overdo it. She said if she noticed my exhaustion passing the limit, she would insist again that I sleep earlier. During this time, Layla also mentioned that she wanted to get pregnant in the near future. That always made me anxious. The budget would be even tighter with another mouth to feed. The arrangement with Melanie started well. On the first day of carpooling, we exchanged few words. She was tired, as was I, so we only talked about the weather and the difficulty of working night shifts. On the following days, she felt more comfortable and began to open up about her routine. She explained that she was raising her children alone, without support from ex-partners. She seemed genuinely exhausted. I thought it was just casual conversation and continued focusing on my plans to save money. About a month later, Layla gave me the news that would change everything. She was pregnant. We had talked about having a child, but we never calculated it would happen so quickly, especially at a time when I was hardly ever home. I felt simultaneously happy and afraid. What would life be like going forward? A baby brings expenses, attention, sleepless nights. But seeing that positive test, I felt it was time to embrace the situation and move forward. I talked to Layla about reinforcing my work as a rideshare driver. She was concerned, but knew we needed all the income possible. My body ached, but the motivation of having a child on the way propelled me forward. There were days when I could barely keep my eyes open while driving, but the idea of a child with nothing at home kept me going. During this period, Melanie continued paying the agreed amount for the nightly ride. Sometimes she would talk about Layla's pregnancy, asking questions or commenting that I seemed enthusiastic. Other times, the conversation had a strange tone, as if she wanted to know details about my relationship, but I didn't encourage it. I thought it was just curiosity. One ordinary night, when picking up Melanie, she asked if we could stop at a pharmacy before heading back to the building. She wanted to buy medicine for her children. There was no problem. It was just a small detour. As I parked, I noticed she was looking at me differently. Suddenly, she held my hand and tried to get closer to kiss me. I froze immediately and pulled back, withdrawing my hand. I said I respected her, but had no interest whatsoever. "I'm sorry, I'm confused," she said. I left feeling a knot in my stomach. I didn't tell Layla anything, fearing it would create jealousy, especially since I needed that additional income for our future family. In the following days, Melanie became more quiet. She would enter the car, greet me with a good evening. We would spend almost the entire journey in silence, and she would only say thank you upon arriving. It seemed like everything would sort itself out naturally, without us having to discuss the incident. One day, she appeared with a homemade brownie, saying it was to thank me for the rides. I thought it was a peace offering and accepted, without thinking twice. I ate the brownie right there in the car as soon as I parked, before going up to my apartment. I tasted the somewhat sweetish and strong flavor, but didn't notice anything unusual. Just thought it was different from the common store-bought kind. That weekend, I began to notice something unusual happening to me. I couldn't stop thinking about Melanie. At first, I believed it was just discomfort from what had happened, but I realized that gradually, a strange desire to see her was growing. It was a craving that didn't make sense, since I loved Layla and we were living the pinnacle of a dream with the arrival of our baby. Still, during my rideshare trips, I found myself remembering Melanie's face, the timbre of her voice. This intensified to the point where I questioned myself. What the hell is happening? I'm not like this. To try to cut this impulse, I told her I could no longer give fixed rides. I made up an excuse that my schedule was changing, and I couldn't manage anymore. "But I need you so much." She became irritated and insisted that she needed me, but contained herself when she saw I was determined to refuse. I tried to distance myself completely. I took other routes on the app, tried to get home earlier, and devoted myself to Layla. But my mind wasn't improving. Thoughts of Melanie tormented me to the point of having insomnia for several nights. I looked at Layla sleeping and felt like the worst of men for having these unwanted desires. On the third or fourth night without seeing her, I couldn't take it anymore. It was as if I was on autopilot. After finishing my shift at the distribution center, I didn't go home. I headed to the grocery store where Melanie worked. I waited for her to come out. I didn't even need to call her. She opened the car door, got in, and stayed silent. After driving a few streets, I stopped in a secluded spot and kissed her desperately, as if I couldn't control myself. I began meeting her at cheap motels, using the excuse that I was doing many extra hours on the app to save money for our future child. I was consumed by guilt, but the desire seemed even stronger. I noticed my body reacting strangely, cold sweats, palpitations. Even hating myself, I repeated everything the next day. Layla was pregnant, counting on my support, and I was hiding from her what was happening. With each lie, each flimsy excuse for arriving late, I felt I was betraying not only my wife, but myself. I began having panic attacks. After being with Melanie in a musty motel room one time, I fell to the floor gasping for air and began saying I wanted to die. Melanie called a taxi and took me to the emergency room. I spent a few hours receiving IV fluids without understanding what I was doing with my life. As soon as I regained some consciousness, she pulled a chair close to the gurney and with a heavy look confessed, "I performed a binding ritual on you." She said she learned it from an older relative, claiming she couldn't stand having a life full of abandonments anymore. And upon seeing that I seemed dedicated and faithful to my wife, she decided to cast this spell to bind me to her. The brownie she had given me wasn't an innocent gift, but a mixture of herbs and ingredients to awaken obsession. My first reaction was a mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief. But everything fit together: the sudden and overwhelming desire, the inability to resist. Without ceremony, she added that to undo the spell, she demanded money. She needed to move far away and start another life, and only then would she perform an unbinding ritual. "I want $3,000, she said. I had almost nothing saved, and the little that existed was reserved for the baby's expenses, due in a few months. Even so, desperation made me agree. I managed to talk to my uncle and made a withdrawal from an emergency fund to gather part of the amount. I arranged to give the money in 2 installments, and she promised to begin the unbinding as soon as she received the first part, but warned that I wouldn't be completely free until I paid everything. I became even more afraid. When I was discharged, I had to lie to Layla, saying I was robbed and beaten. I invented that they took part of the money I had in the bank, which would justify an immediate withdrawal. Pregnant and sensitive, she was terrified seeing me with bandages. I felt a lump in my throat receiving her care, knowing I was to blame for all that mess. I delivered half the amount to Melanie a few days later. I don't know what she did, but over the following weeks, that obsession began to lose strength, although I still had disturbing memories. One day, I heard moving noises from the floor above in the early morning. I saw a truck parked outside and some men carrying furniture. She sent me a short message, got the rest. "I'm leaving. Don't worry, you'll be fine." Her phone was out of service after that, and she disappeared. I thought from then on, my life would get back on track. I started coming home earlier, accompanied Layla to appointments, bought baby clothes, and regained some peace. The guilt was eating away at me, but I tried to make up for it by dedicating all my time to Layla. She was excited, arranging a corner in the bedroom for the crib. Still, I never told her about the infidelity or the spell. Almost a month after Melanie's departure, something began to disturb me within the building. One night when I arrived tired, I came across the door of her former apartment slightly ajar. It could have been the building manager cleaning the place to rent again. But as I passed through the corridor, I had the distinct feeling that someone inside was watching me. I thought about closing the door, but it was unlocked. I preferred to go straight to my apartment. The following night, I got up to get water and noticed the corridor exuded a strange smell, something like burnt herbs. I looked through the peephole and saw no one. As a precaution, I placed an iron against the door, fearing an intruder. The next day, I asked the building manager if they had come to clean or inspect the property, and he denied it. He said the owner was still advertising the vacancy and hadn't scheduled a visit. My unease increased. I began having recurring dreams where I saw Melanie lighting candles and murmuring unknown words. According to the dream, she was in a corner of the building, repeating a low chant with an intense gaze. I would wake up sweaty and terrified, but tried to ignore it as mere remnants of guilt. Layla gave birth to boy Noah on a late afternoon. Everything was fine with her and the baby, and the emotion of holding my son in my arms was so intense that it almost erased all the bad memories. Upon returning home with the newborn, I tried to focus on helping her. I learned to change diapers, burp the little one, and warm the bath water. I thought this routine would distract me from any dark story. For a while it worked, but 2 weeks after Noah's birth, disturbing facts started happening again. Sometimes I would wake up in the early morning to the baby's cry and notice a sound of dragging footsteps in the corridor. Layla also complained of a strange sensation, as if it were colder near the entrance door. "It seems something hasn't been resolved in this building, Marcus," she said. "Sometimes I get chills." I tried to minimize it, saying she was sensitive because of the postpartum period. I myself didn't have the courage to admit that I also noticed noises, and some nights I observed the doorknob of our apartment moving slightly. On a day off, I gathered courage and went to a small esoteric shop. I was discreet, asked for advice on how to ward off negative energies. The owner offered me a basic kit: coarse salt, an amulet, herbs for smudging, and holy water. I bought everything, pretending it was just curiosity. At home, during the night, I took the baby, placed him in the crib, and asked Layla to rest, saying I would handle changing the diaper if he cried. Then I lit the herbs, said a prayer asking for protection, and passed through the apartment door, spreading the smoke, praying quietly. When I got near Melanie's former apartment, I heard a slight crack but saw nothing. I returned inside and slept hugging that amulet, feeling half ridiculous and half secure. In the following days, I continued with this kind of ritual, spreading the herb smell and throwing coarse salt on the doorstep. For a time, it seemed to work. The building manager commented that he no longer felt any weird smell in the corridor. Layla noticed that Noah slept a whole night without crying. I was optimistic, but the calm lasted only a short while. One Sunday morning, the building manager informed me that the upstairs apartment, the same one where Melanie had lived, had been rented. A family with a man, Victor, his wife Sophia, and a 5-year-old daughter, Lily, would move in the next few days. Upon hearing this, I felt relief, as if the presence of new neighbors could scare away any remnant of the past. I even put the amulet in a drawer, thinking everything was resolved. Victor and Sophia arrived with their belongings on a stuffy afternoon. I helped carry some boxes, trying to be friendly. Their daughter ran through the corridors, excited. I noticed that the place, empty for almost a month, smelled of mold, but I didn't detect any abnormal odor. I was happy thinking that this family could bring new life to the building. After a couple of days, however, I crossed paths with Sophia at the entrance, and she commented, "Do you know if this apartment has any problem? Since we arrived, I feel as if someone's walking around in the middle of the night inside." I pretended not to know anything, said it might be the old wood creaking or ancient plumbing. She smiled but didn't seem convinced. That night, Layla noticed I was tense and asked if something was bothering me. I replied it was just fatigue. She was still recovering from childbirth, so I avoided burdening her with strange explanations. A few more nights passed, and I realized that although I no longer heard so much noise in the corridor, things upstairs were getting worse. Sophia appeared at my door one day, almost knocking desperately. She wanted to use my phone to call a relative, because theirs wasn't installed yet. She mentioned something about her daughter having an unexplained fever, waking up in the middle of the night screaming, saying she saw a woman near the bedroom door. That gave me an internal chill, but I tried to stay calm. Layla concerned about Sophia's state when I talked to her. I was left not knowing what to do. I ended up remembering the esoteric shop, but also thought about seeking more traditional religious help. There was a small church not far from the building. I went there on a day off, spoke with the pastor, Pastor Michael, and explained that I felt a strange presence in my home and in the apartment above. He asked me if anything serious had happened before, and I disguised it, saying I didn't have details. Even so, he offered to bless the place if the residents authorized it. I told this to Victor, who, in desperation, agreed. We scheduled with the pastor for the weekend. He arrived with his Bible and a small bowl of holy water. He said prayers in the corridor, asked to enter both apartments. In my house, Layla and I accompanied everything in silence, and the baby slept peacefully the entire time. Upstairs, Sophia stood beside her husband, holding their daughter in her arms. After the pastor finished, for a day or two, everything seemed calm. Sophia said she felt the environment lighter. I thought that finally things would settle down. About a week passed without major incidents. But one Sunday, I woke up with Layla calling me to the living room. At the door, there was a handwritten note with my name and something like, "You thought everything would end like this," in smudged letters. It seemed scribbled with some kind of dark ink. I showed it to Layla, making up that it was probably a joke from some inconsiderate resident or ex-neighbor. She was frightened. That same week, Victor met me in the corridor and told me he received an anonymous call. He answered, but the person said nothing, just breathing deeply. He didn't pay much attention to it, but Sophia was distressed, associating everything with something supernatural. I tried to calm him down. Still, I had a nagging worry. Could Melanie have maintained some connection with the place? At this point, I remembered a healer, whom a colleague from the distribution center spoke well of, Mrs. Josephine. They said she knew how to deal with binding work and could identify spiritual residues. I spoke with Victor and Sophia, who, in desperation, agreed to talk to her. I scheduled a visit on a weekday. Mrs. Josephine, an elderly lady with a gentle speech, arrived at the building with a fabric bag full of herbs, candles, and small vials. We all went to the upstairs apartment, as that's where the family was going through the worst situation. Mrs. Josephine walked through the rooms, sprinkled water mixed with herbs, and recited the Lord's Prayer quietly. After a few minutes, she declared, "Some kind of heavy work was done here. I feel there's still something impregnated in the walls." Victor and Sophia were astonished, and I shrank because I knew the origin of this could be linked to Melanie's spell. The healer placed candles in the corners and asked us all to leave the apartment for a moment. We stood in the corridor in silence, hearing noises as if light furniture was being dragged from one side to another inside. About 10 minutes later, she came out sweaty, saying she calmed the energy but couldn't remove everything. She commented that the pastor's blessing had weakened part of the influence, but a binding ritual usually leaves deeper marks. She suggested repeating the cleansing for several days until she felt everything would dissipate completely. Victor and Sophia agreed to receive Mrs. Josephine every night for a week. I offered to help with whatever was needed, while Layla took care of our baby. I accompanied part of the ritual, trying to disguise my guilt. During these days, the atmosphere in the building felt heavy. Their daughter continued with a fever for a few more days, but started improving gradually. Sometimes I heard faint noises, as if someone passed hurriedly through the corridor, but when I checked, there was no one. At the end of the week, Mrs. Josephine said she had completed the cleansing. She recommended that Victor leave a plate with coarse salt on the doorstep for 7 days and recite prayers every night. He did everything according to the instructions. Sophia seemed relieved seeing her daughter sleep without nightmares. I began to believe that finally everything would be at peace. Life followed a more serene rhythm. I focused more and more on Layla and Noah, trying to redeem myself somehow. Victor continued in the apartment above without new complaints. Sophia thanked me for my help, and the girl returned to playing in the corridors without fear. It seemed that at last, the ghost or whatever it was had gone away with Melanie's departure and the spiritual cleansings. Yet from time to time during the night, I still felt a small restlessness, as if some marks couldn't be completely erased. Time passed, and Noah completed about 1 year of life. We had a simple little party in the apartment. Victor, Sophia, and Lily came to sing happy birthday. Layla was radiant. As we ate cake, I caught myself looking at the staircase that went up to the floor above. I felt a twinge in my stomach, recalling everything that had happened there. I took a deep breath, held my son in my arms, and at that moment promised that I would do everything to ensure he would never face the ghosts that I myself had let into our lives. The world moved on, and I never again had any concrete news about Melanie, nor did I get to know where she went to live. I didn't even pronounce her name to Layla. Everything remains a bit undefined when I look back, but I stay firm in my decision to protect my family. If someday Layla discovers the truth, may she forgive me. For now, I live with this stain on my conscience, and the certainty that when we play with unknown things or allow ourselves to be manipulated by them, it's possible to open doors that don't always completely close. There are moments in life when a seemingly innocent decision can lead us down unexpected paths. A choice that appeared logical, a routine situation, until something happens and everything changes. This is my story, and though years have passed, I still think about it often. I never imagined something like this could happen to me, and I believe sharing this account might serve as a warning to others. It was the winter of 2011, before home-sharing apps had become mainstream. I was working for a consulting firm that specialized in corporate restructuring, which meant frequent travel across the country. My wife Lisa, who typically accompanied me on these trips, decided to stay with her parents this time, as she was 6 months pregnant with our first child. Her father had recently undergone knee surgery, and she wanted to help her mother care for him. The issue was our dog, Rusty, a 3-year-old golden retriever with boundless energy and unwavering loyalty. Lisa's mother suffered from severe pet allergies, so Rusty couldn't stay with them. Since my trips usually lasted no more than 5 days, I decided to bring him along rather than board him at a kennel. For this particular assignment, I was headed to Portland, Maine, a small coastal city I'd never visited before. It was mid-January, and the forecast predicted heavy snowfall throughout my stay. The company would cover my accommodation expenses, so I searched for a pet-friendly rental close to the client's office. After browsing for hours, I found only one suitable option: a small, standalone cottage on the outskirts of town. The listing had minimal photos and no reviews, which should have been my first warning sign. But I'd never encountered problems with rentals before, and the location was perfect. Just a 15-minute drive from where I needed to be. The owner, who called himself Thomas, had just listed the property and offered a reasonable price. Our communication was limited to brief messages about check-in procedures. Unlike other hosts who would send paragraphs welcoming you to their space or offering local recommendations, Thomas was curt and matter-of-fact. He simply told me where to find the keys, under a loose brick by the back entrance, and the Wi-Fi password. No pleasantries, no enjoy your stay, nothing. At the time, I wrote it off as just his personality. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The cottage was nestled at the end of a winding driveway, surrounded by tall pine trees, and separated from neighboring properties by at least 100 yards on each side. It looked charming in the fading winter light, a small blue structure with white trim and a steep roof designed to shed snow. The inside was clean if sparsely furnished. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a worn but comfortable couch facing an older model television. Behind the cottage was a fenced yard, which I thought would be perfect for Rusty to run around without me having to take him on leashed walks in the unfamiliar area. The fence was about 6 feet high, constructed of wooden planks with small gaps between them, enough to see through, but not enough for Rusty to escape. The first sign that something was off came that very evening. After settling in and unpacking, I let Rusty into the backyard. Usually, he'd explore new spaces with enthusiasm, sniffing every corner, marking territory, and generally acting like he owned the place. But this time was different. As soon as his paws touched the snow-covered ground, his entire demeanor changed. His ears pinned back, his tail tucked between his legs, and he froze in place. When I encouraged him to explore, he reluctantly took a few steps forward before darting toward the far corner of the yard. There he began to dig frantically at the snow, whimpering and growling intermittently. "Rusty, come here, boy," I called, but he ignored me, something he rarely did. He continued digging with increasing desperation, his whimpers escalating to alarmed barks. The sudden change in his behavior unsettled me, especially since he was typically so well behaved. After several failed attempts to call him back, I had to physically go and retrieve him, practically dragging him back inside. Once in the cottage, Rusty wouldn't settle down. He paced between the back door and the window overlooking the yard, whining and occasionally letting out short, sharp barks. I tried distracting him with his favorite toys and treats, but nothing worked. Eventually, I had to put him in his travel crate, just so I could get some sleep before my first day of work. Even in the crate, he remained restless, making soft whining sounds throughout the night. I barely slept, and when morning came, I was exhausted. I left Rusty inside the cottage when I went to work, worried that whatever had upset him in the yard might cause him to bark all day and disturb any neighbors. When I returned that evening, I found him exactly where I'd left him, by the back door, staring intently at the yard. The look in his eyes was one I'd never seen before, a mixture of fear and alertness that sent chills down my spine. Nevertheless, I figured he needed exercise, so I decided to take him for a walk around the front of the property instead of using the backyard. It was on our second night that things escalated. Around 2 a.m, I was awakened by Rusty's low growl. He'd somehow gotten out of his crate and was standing rigid by the bedroom window, his eyes fixed on the backyard. As I got up to check what had caught his attention, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint but unmistakable, sobbing, a soft, mournful cry that seemed to be coming from somewhere in the yard. At first, I thought I might be dreaming, but Rusty's reaction confirmed I wasn't imagining things. His growl deepened, and the hair along his spine stood on end. I approached the window cautiously and peered through the blinds. The yard was illuminated by moonlight reflecting off the snow, creating an eerie blue glow. I scanned the entire area, but saw nothing unusual, no person, no animal, nothing that could explain the sound. Yet the sobbing continued, seeming to rise from the ground itself in the far corner, where Rusty had been digging earlier. "Hello," I called out, loud enough to be heard outside. "Is someone there?" The crying abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more unnerving than the sound had been. Rusty remained on high alert, his eyes never leaving that corner of the yard. I considered calling the police, but reasoned that they'd find nothing, just like I had, and would probably think I was overreacting or had been dreaming. Instead, I spent the rest of the night sitting up with Rusty, both of us watching the yard until dawn broke. Nothing further happened, but sleep was impossible. By morning, I was beginning to question my own senses. Had I really heard someone crying, or was it just the wind playing tricks on my tired mind? I went to work in a fog that day, counting the hours until I could check out and head home. Thankfully, it was my final day in Portland. I'd completed my assignment and was scheduled to leave the following morning. Just one more night, I told myself. One more night, and then we're out of here. That evening, I kept Rusty close, not even considering letting him into the backyard. We stayed in the living room, the TV on for background noise as I worked on my final report. Around 9 o'clock, just as I was finishing up, the power went out. The cottage plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my laptop screen. I used my phone's flashlight to find some candles in the kitchen drawers and lit them, creating small pools of flickering light in the room. Rusty, who had been dozing on the couch, suddenly jerked awake and stared at the back door. A moment later, I heard a sharp, metallic click, the sound of the door latch turning. My heart nearly stopped. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, when a thunderous pounding shook the front door. Rusty erupted into frenzied barking, lunging toward the entrance. Peering through the peephole, I saw not an intruder, but the illuminated badges of 3 police officers. With shaking hands, I opened the door. "Sir, we need you to come with us right now," the lead officer said without preamble, his expression grim beneath the beam of his flashlight. "What's happening?" I asked, clutching Rusty's collar to keep him from charging forward. "Are you staying here temporarily?" The female officer to his right asked, her eyes scanning the interior of the cottage visible beyond my shoulder. I nodded. "Yes, I rented it for 3 nights. I check out tomorrow morning." The officers exchanged glances before the third one spoke. "Sir, we have a search warrant for this property. The owner, Thomas Mercer, is a suspect in an ongoing investigation. We need you to gather your belongings and vacate the premises immediately." Investigation. What kind of investigation? My voice sounded distant, as if someone else was speaking. The lead officer hesitated, then apparently decided I deserved to know. "Mr. Mercer is a person of interest in connection with several disappearances over the past decade. We have reason to believe this property may contain evidence related to those cases." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "Disappearances," I echoed, my mind racing to the crying I'd heard, to Rusty's strange behavior in the backyard. "Sir, please pack your things now," the female officer urged. "We'll wait for you, but we need to begin our search as soon as possible." In a daze, I gathered my belongings and Rusty's supplies, shoving everything haphazardly into my suitcase. As I was about to leave, I turned to the officers. "My dog, he's been acting strange since we got here, especially in the backyard. He was digging in the snow in the far corner and wouldn't come when called. And last night I heard someone crying out there." The officers' expressions changed. The lead officer motioned to his colleagues, who immediately headed toward the back of the cottage. "We'll need a statement from you," he said, his voice now carrying an edge of urgency. "But first, we need to get you to a safe location." They escorted me to a motel nearby, where I gave my full statement to a detective who arrived an hour later. I told her everything: Rusty's behavior, the crying, the atmosphere of unease that had permeated the cottage from the moment we arrived. 2 days later, as I was boarding my flight home, the detective called with an update. What she told me confirmed my worst fears and has haunted me ever since. Using ground-penetrating radar, they had discovered 11 bodies buried in the backyard of the cottage, all in varying states of decomposition, with the most recent victim believed to have been buried just weeks before my arrival. The corner where Rusty had been frantically digging was where they found the shallowest grave. Thomas Mercer, it turned out, wasn't even the owner's real name. His actual identity was Jeffrey Walsh, a man who had been on the FBI's radar for years in connection with a string of disappearances across New England. He had purchased the isolated cottage 5 years earlier and had recently begun renting it out sporadically, possibly as a way to establish an alibi or to disguise the true purpose of the property. The detective explained that Walsh targeted lone travelers, people who wouldn't be immediately missed or whose absences could be explained away. He had been captured at a border crossing, attempting to flee to Canada, and under interrogation had confessed to murders spanning more than 15 years. I often think about how close I came to becoming one of his victims. Was I spared because I had Rusty with me, or because I didn't fit his preferred victim profile? The detective suggested that Walsh typically spent time observing his potential victims before making his move, learning their routines, assessing their vulnerabilities. Perhaps my 3-night stay was too brief for him to complete this process. Or perhaps Rusty's presence deterred him. Whatever the reason, I'm grateful to be alive to tell this story. But the experience has changed me profoundly. I no longer stay in rentals without extensive reviews. I'm wary of isolated properties, and I pay close attention when my pets behave unusually in new environments. Most importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts. That feeling of unease I experienced from the moment we arrived wasn't paranoia. It was a warning. Nature has a way of sensing disturbances in the natural order. And sometimes, the most reliable alarm system is the one that doesn't speak our language, but communicates through behavior. If you take anything from my experience, let it be this. Listen when something doesn't feel right. Your intuition, like Rusty's instincts, might be sensing danger that your conscious mind hasn't yet registered. That awareness could one day save your life, as it may very well have saved mine. This is a story that transformed my life and taught me lessons I'll never forget. I'm certain that anyone who has experienced something similar involving dark magic will identify with what I went through. It happened several years ago when I was living in Portland, Maine. At that time, I was fighting to achieve a lifelong dream, opening a small artisanal bakery. What happened, however, not only shook my faith in the people around me, but also showed me how devastating envy can truly be. Since childhood, I had always loved preparing recipes. Those afternoons in the kitchen with my grandmother, creating pies and cookies, were the most special moments of my life. Turning this passion into a profession wasn't easy. I saved money for years, dedicated myself fully, and finally managed to open my bakery despite facing doubts and criticism, including those from Rebecca, a friend I'd known since college. Rebecca and I met during freshman year, and despite our differences, our friendship continued. I was always optimistic, while she viewed everything with suspicion and negativity. She had tried various ventures herself, a vintage clothing store, a small coffee shop, but none of her businesses lasted. She blamed everything: fate, people, the economy, though it was evident that her pessimistic attitude dampened even the best opportunities. When my bakery opened, Rebecca showed support. She brought a beautiful arrangement of wildflowers to the grand opening and congratulated me enthusiastically. But soon I began to notice comments that sounded strange. "I hope everything goes well, even with so much competition around here." Or she'd mention that my shop wasn't in a favorable location. I thought it was just honesty and didn't pay much attention. With time, however, her words began to sound like disguised criticism. The bakery soon prospered. The entire neighborhood loved my sourdough bread and maple pastries. Orders for events started coming in, and my income grew. It was an enormous achievement for me, but it also brought something unexpected: Rebecca's envy. One evening, while I was working on a large wedding cake order, Rebecca appeared suddenly. She seemed nervous and visibly upset. "I don't know how you do it, Emily," she said, pacing around my kitchen. "Everything always works out for you. Sometimes I think I wasn't born with luck." She tried to smile, but her eyes told a different story. I attempted to comfort her, explaining that success requires effort and patience, but her expression left me uncomfortable. Shortly after that visit, strange things began to happen. Orders were delayed without explanation. The industrial mixer would stop working mid-batch. The oven would shut off by itself, and some customers complained about the taste of my bread, even though I used the same ingredients and recipes. At first, I thought these were normal equipment failures, but the incidents became increasingly peculiar. One night, while cleaning the kitchen, I found ashes formed in a perfect circle near the back door. I had no idea how they got there, but an eerie feeling took hold of me. Days later, an elderly customer entered the bakery, looking concerned. "Emily, do you know anyone who might be jealous of you?" she asked quietly. "I ask because I've seen strange things around your shop at night." Hearing her words, my mind went straight to Rebecca and her attitude, but I refused to believe that a friend could act so cruelly. However, the problems continued. One morning, opening the bakery, I discovered a small red velvet pouch tucked behind the cash register. Inside were dried herbs, pins, and what looked like a clump of hair. A shiver ran down my spine, and I realized I needed help. A neighboring shop owner suggested I seek out Mrs. Sullivan, a woman known for dealing with negative energies. Without thinking twice, I went to her home with the pouch. As soon as she saw the contents, Mrs. Sullivan frowned and threw everything into her fireplace. "This is bad business, Emily," she said gravely. "Someone consumed by envy is trying to harm you. We need to cleanse your bakery and protect it before the situation worsens." That same afternoon, Mrs. Sullivan came to my establishment. She burned sage, placed small crystals in the corners, and murmured prayers I didn't understand, but that brought some relief. Before leaving, she gave me a small bottle of blessed water to sprinkle at the entrance every night, and an amulet to carry with me. Despite these precautions, the strange occurrences didn't stop. One night, while closing the bakery, I felt as if someone was watching me. Looking through the window, I saw a shadow that quickly disappeared behind the row of oak trees across the street. My heart raced, and the first person who came to mind was Rebecca. Some days later, I decided to confront her. I invited her for coffee at a neutral location, and without beating around the bush, asked if she knew anything about the problems at the bakery. Her reaction was disconcerting. A cold smile and words that cut like a knife. "Maybe your luck isn't as good as it seems," she said, stirring her coffee slowly. "Not everything you have is as perfect as it appears." Though vague, her words and attitude confirmed my suspicions. I consulted with Mrs. Sullivan again, who told me it wouldn't be simple to undo a work of envy, but she was willing to help me. That night we began a more intense ritual, not just to protect the bakery, but also to safeguard my energy. It was then that I realized how far Rebecca would go to sabotage my happiness. After that conversation, my suspicion only grew. Rebecca seemed to avoid direct details, but her posture and cynical smile spoke louder than any words. I decided not to press further, but my intuition told me she was behind the problems plaguing my business. The following days were filled with anxiety and frustration. Ingredients I purchased spoiled quickly. Customers began canceling orders without explanation, and the atmosphere in the bakery seemed heavy with an oppressive energy. I returned to Mrs. Sullivan, begging for a definitive solution. She agreed to perform a more intense spiritual cleansing. but warned that it might bring difficult truths to light. If someone is behind this, the energy will return to that person, and they will be revealed, she cautioned. I was ready to face anything to regain my peace. The cleansing took place the following night after closing. Mrs. Sullivan lit black and white candles, drew a circle of salt on the floor, and recited prayers while incense filled the air. The tension grew as she progressed with the ritual. At a certain point, the atmosphere became heavy, as if something was resisting expulsion. Suddenly, one of the black candles extinguished by itself. Mrs. Sullivan stopped and looked at me seriously. This confirms what I suspected. Someone close to you cast this work. Now we need to find out who. She asked me to bring anything that might have a connection to Rebecca or anyone who frequently visited the bakery. I remembered the times Rebecca appeared without warning, with that fake smile and seemingly harmless comments that now sounded loaded with hidden intentions. The next day, while searching the bakery thoroughly, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A golden pendant in the shape of a crow, hidden behind a decorative flour sack on a shelf. It wasn't mine, nor did it belong to any customer that I knew of. I immediately took it to Mrs. Sullivan, who examined it carefully. This was placed here as an anchor point for negative energy, she explained. Whoever put it here knew exactly what they were doing. I think you already have an idea who it might be. There was concern and firmness in her voice. Although everything pointed to Rebecca, it was still difficult to accept that she would do something so low. I decided to confront her again. I arranged a meeting at a cafe, and after a few minutes of trivial conversation, I took the pendant from my purse and placed it on the table. Rebecca, I found this in the bakery. Do you know anything about it? For a brief moment, her face betrayed surprise, her eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. What does that have to do with me? Anyone could have left that there. Maybe you're imagining things. She tried to change the subject, but her defensive posture said more than her words. I realized she wouldn't confess anything. I decided I didn't need her admission and returned to Mrs. Sullivan's house. She prepared a new, even more intense ritual. This time, she guided me to release any feelings of hurt or fear while the ritual took place. It was an exhausting process, but at the end, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. From that moment on, things began to change. The atmosphere in the bakery became light and welcoming. The equipment worked without problems, and customers returned enthusiastically, praising my baked goods. However, something curious happened with Rebecca. A mutual friend told me that she had begun to face inexplicable situations. Lights flickering on their own, mirrors becoming foggy without reason, and a constant sensation of being watched. Soon after, a business venture she was trying to launch failed, and people close to her began to distance themselves. Then one day, Rebecca appeared at my bakery. She looked haggard, with dark circles under her eyes and an expression of pure desperation. "Emily, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. I invited her in, and after a long silence, she finally admitted, "Yes, it was me who left those objects in your bakery. I couldn't handle the fact that you were happy and successful, while I only accumulated failures. I thought that by disrupting your luck, things would change for me, but everything spiraled out of control." She confessed through tears, revealing that she had sought someone to perform dark magic rituals, but that everything had turned against her. Despite the pain and resentment I felt, I realized that Rebecca was reaping the consequences of her choices. I suggested that she seek help to cleanse her energy, but was firm in saying that our friendship had no future. The betrayal had left a deep mark, impossible to erase. As the days passed, peace was reestablished. The bakery achieved even greater success, and I emerged from this experience with a precious lesson about people and the energies that surround us. Although Rebecca remains in the past, her story serves as a constant reminder. Envy can be intense, but it never overcomes dedication and purity of intentions. What I learned from all this wasn't just about protecting myself from negative energies, but understanding that success built on genuine effort creates a shield of its own. Today, 5 years later, my bakery has expanded to 3 locations across New England, and I make it a practice to mentor young aspiring bakers, teaching them not just recipes, but also the importance of creating with love and respecting the journey of others. As for Rebecca, I heard she moved to Arizona and started over. I sincerely hope she found peace and learned that the only magic worth pursuing is the kind you create yourself, through hard work and authenticity. Sometimes, the darkest experiences illuminate our path forward in ways we never expected. I live in a modest cabin nestled in the dense forests of northern Montana. It's secluded enough to give me peace, yet close enough to a small town that I don't feel completely isolated. My workspace is in the loft area, where I've arranged my desk next to a large picture window, overlooking the gravel driveway that winds through the pines. I've always loved keeping that window open to enjoy the crisp mountain air, and occasionally observe wildlife wandering by. It was early spring, and the snow had just melted, leaving everything with that fresh scent of renewal. The window stayed open most days as I worked from home, the gentle breeze keeping me company through long stretches of coding. One Wednesday afternoon, as the sun reached its zenith, something caught my eye through the window. There was a man standing at the end of my driveway, where it met the forest road. He wasn't just passing by or stopping to check his phone, nothing like that. He stood completely motionless, staring directly at my cabin. I couldn't tell if he could see me through the window, but after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, he simply turned and disappeared into the tree line. I found it strange, but tried not to overthink it. Perhaps he was a hiker who had gotten lost, or maybe someone scouting hunting locations, though it wasn't hunting season. I returned to my work, occasionally glancing outside, but when nothing else happened, I let my concerns fade away. The following day proceeded normally. I had a mountain of assignments to complete and several video conferences scheduled with colleagues on the East Coast. During one particularly tedious meeting about quarterly projections, I absently gazed out the window again, and there he was, the same man in the same position, staring fixedly at the cabin just as he had the previous day. This time I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It was far more disturbing now. Why was he back? I kept my eyes on him long enough that one of my colleagues noticed my distraction. "Everything okay, Alex?" they asked. I mumbled something affirmative and tried to refocus on the conversation, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. He remained there for about 3 minutes, and when I looked again after answering a question about my project timeline, he had vanished once more. The rest of the day dragged on interminably. I couldn't stop thinking about that man standing at the edge of my property. As soon as I logged off work, I grabbed my jacket and flashlight, even though it was still light out, and went to investigate the spot where he had been standing. There was nothing unusual there, just some pine needles and dirt. But I realized something that made my stomach drop. From that exact position, there was a perfect sightline to my workspace window. He could clearly see me while I worked. I hurried back inside, locked all the doors and windows, made dinner, and later called my sister in Seattle. I told her what had happened, and while she agreed it was unsettling, she suggested it might be nothing serious. Maybe a surveyor or someone new to the area who was just curious. Still, she told me to keep my doors locked, which I had already done. Later that night, around 11, as I was watching a documentary with the volume low, I heard something outside. It sounded like footsteps on the wooden deck that wrapped around my cabin. I froze, then quickly got up and moved toward the front door. The footsteps came closer, paused for a moment, then began to retreat. I rushed to the door and peered through the peephole, just catching a glimpse of a figure walking back toward the tree line. After waiting a few seconds to make sure he was gone, I carefully opened the door and discovered a small piece of paper pinned under a rock on my welcome mat. The note contained only 4 words: "Alex, let me in." I wasn't just confused, I was terrified. How did he know my name? What did this note mean? The person hadn't even knocked or waited long enough for me to answer. Not that I would have dared open the door. It was enough to make me call the county sheriff. A deputy arrived about 40 minutes later. Response times were never quick this far out, and I explained everything that had happened. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do. There had been no explicit threat, no property damage, and no crime beyond perhaps a minor trespass. The deputy took my statement and promised to drive by my property during his patrol shifts over the next few days. This provided little comfort. That night I stayed awake much later than usual, lying rigid in my bed, unable to sleep. My mind kept replaying events. The man watching my cabin, the disturbing note. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:27 in the morning when I heard 3 distinct knocks on my front door. The sound echoed through the silent cabin, freezing me in place. The silence that followed was almost unbearable until the knocks came again. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher assured me they would send deputies as quickly as possible. But out here, that could mean 20 minutes or more. The knocking continued as I waited. It was unnervingly steady, not getting louder or faster, just rhythmically persistent. As I moved through the dark hallways of the cabin, still on the phone with the dispatcher, I was told the deputies were about 3 minutes away. That's when I noticed a longer pause between knocks. 15 seconds passed, then 30, then a full minute with no sound. When the deputies finally arrived, there was no one at the door. Once again, they were too late. I explained what had happened, and this time they seemed to take the situation more seriously. They searched the surrounding area with flashlights, but found nothing except some muddy footprints on the deck that disappeared into the forest. Despite their increased concern, there still wasn't much they could do beyond promising to increase patrols in the area for the next couple of weeks. They also suggested I install security cameras, which I ordered the very next day and had installed by the weekend. The system included motion sensor lights and notifications sent directly to my phone anytime movement was detected near the cabin. The weeks passed, and the man never reappeared, at least not that I saw or that the cameras captured. I still find myself checking the footage obsessively every morning, half expecting to see him standing motionless at the end of my driveway, just out of reach of the motion sensors. It's been nearly 6 months now, and there have been no further signs of him. Despite this, the memory continues to haunt me. I think about that chilling note asking me to open the door, and those knocks in the dead of night. It's deeply unsettling, and the thought that he might return still lurks in the back of my mind, especially on quiet nights when the wind makes the cabin creak and groan. Last week I received a letter in my mailbox. No stamp, no postmark. Inside was a single photograph of me sitting at my desk by the window, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from the forest beyond my property line. On the back, written in the same handwriting as the previous note, were the words, "I'm still watching, Alex." I called the sheriff immediately, but I already know what they'll say. Without knowing who he is or catching him in the act, there's little they can do. I've thought about moving, starting over somewhere else, somewhere more populated. But a part of me wonders, would that really stop him? Or would I just be bringing my shadow with me? For now, I've covered all my windows with blackout curtains. I never work by the window anymore. And each night before bed, I check every lock twice, set the alarm, and still struggle to fall asleep. Because somewhere out there, I know he's watching, waiting, and I don't know what he wants or when he'll return. My name is Alex. Some time ago, I decided to rent an Airbnb with my parents in a small coastal town in Maine. The reason? My sister's wedding was going to be held there. We arrived a few days before the ceremony to help with the preparations and support my future sister-in-law. The house we stayed in wasn't very large, just a Victorian-style 2-story structure with a weathered exterior. It was enchanting in its own way, decorated in that classic New England style with navy blues and faded whites, characteristic of those charming seaside towns. I remember we arrived during a fierce winter storm, sometime around midnight. Exhausted from the long drive through the blizzard, we immediately went to sleep. We needed to recover our energy to face the organizational days ahead. That first night seemed peaceful, or at least nobody mentioned anything unusual, since we were all dead tired. The next day, we left early to visit the venue, finalize details with the florist, and take care of other wedding tasks. To be honest, I found it all rather tedious. I've never had patience for matters related to decoration and logistics. Noticing my restlessness, my mother suggested I explore the town and return to the house only in the evening. I accepted the idea immediately. In the late afternoon, around 5 o'clock, I set out to explore, but I quickly regretted it. The cold was unbearable, and the icy wind cut through my jacket like knives. I decided to return to the Airbnb, take a hot shower, order something to eat, and rest. As soon as I arrived, I went straight to the bathroom. It was almost 6 in the evening. While showering, I heard noises coming from downstairs. I thought it might be my parents returning early, although I found it strange since they still had much to do and were planning to eat dinner out. I called out to them several times, but there was no response. I stepped out of the bathroom with just a towel wrapped around me and went downstairs to check. The house was empty, no sign of anyone. This intrigued me, but I continued with my plans. I got dressed, ordered food through an app, and turned on the TV in my room to watch a series while I waited. Not even 5 minutes had passed since I lay down when I heard the noises from downstairs again. This time it sounded like wheels, as if someone was wheeling something across the old wooden floors. Maybe a cart. That sound made me freeze. I lowered the volume on the television to listen better. Without a doubt, the sound came from something old with that characteristic creaking. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my pocket knife that I always carry and went downstairs again to investigate. Once more, there was nobody there. The house remained as before, practically without furniture except for the essentials. Nothing that could explain the sound of wheels. I returned to my room, still uneasy, and tried to resume watching my show. A few minutes later, I received a notification that my food had been delivered. I ran downstairs. It was around 8 in the evening, and the sky had darkened completely, the snow falling in thick flakes outside the window. As soon as I opened the door, I saw the delivery person already getting back into their car to leave. I shouted, letting them know I was responsible for the order. They responded without hesitation. I already gave it to the old lady in the wheelchair. I stood motionless for several seconds, trying to process the situation. I looked around the porch, hoping to find someone, but it was completely empty except for fresh tracks in the snow, tracks that looked like they could have been made by wheels. I asked the delivery person who this woman was that they mentioned. An elderly woman in a wheelchair, they replied. She opened the door, took the food without saying anything, and closed it immediately afterward. My face must have gone pale because they asked if I was okay. I nodded, thanked them quickly, and let them go. As soon as they left, I searched the entire house, including the narrow corridor-like backyard. I found no one. When I entered the kitchen, I noticed the food bag sitting on the table. A shiver ran through my entire body. I ran upstairs to get my cell phone and call my parents. Not wanting to frighten them, I simply asked where they were so I could join them. They told me they were at the restaurant, already asking for the check and preparing to return. While waiting, I locked myself in my room and turned on the TV, trying to ward off the fear, but it was useless. The sound of creaking wheels still echoed through the house, and now I was certain it was a wheelchair. More than that, I knew it wasn't someone alive. When I finally heard my parents' voices as they returned, I ran downstairs and told them everything that had happened. I don't know if they believed me, but I begged to go to a hotel. They refused, reminding me that the stay was already paid for the entire week. My hope vanished, but that same night, my mother changed her mind. We were awakened by a scream from downstairs. I rushed down the stairs with my father ahead of me, both of us shouting, "What happened?" We reached the kitchen and found my mother pale, almost crying, with an expression of pure terror. She said she had gone down for a glass of water and saw an elderly woman in a wheelchair passing through the back corridor. The back door was open, clearly revealing the outside, now covered in at least 3 inches of fresh snow. Yet the wheelchair tracks ran clearly through it. My father and I immediately went to check, but as expected, there was no one there, just those impossible tracks in the snow that seemed to disappear at the property line. My mother was distraught, insisting she couldn't sleep in that house anymore. At that moment, we decided to leave. We left in a hurry, without even notifying the host. The next day, I contacted her to explain that we wouldn't be staying any longer, and thanked her for the accommodation. The host seemed uncomfortable, insisting on meeting us in person, probably concerned about the rating we might leave on the app. My mother agreed to meet her, but our decision to leave was already made. When the host arrived, it was the first time we'd seen her. A young woman, perhaps around 35, very polite. She wanted to understand why we were leaving before the end of our stay, and asked for our honesty, mentioning that the previous guests had also abandoned the house before the end of their reservation. My mother told her everything that happened. The host was shocked. She revealed that the other tenants had also reported the presence of an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Then she told us the truth. That house had belonged to her grandmother, who had died there. After inheriting the property, she decided to rent it out since she lived with her own family in another residence. She explained that she had almost no contact with her grandmother, as the old woman had severed ties with her mother when she was still a child. According to her mother, the elderly woman had a difficult temperament, someone truly bitter, which justified the family estrangement. The woman died alone in that house, victim of a heart attack during a particularly harsh winter storm. The host said she was surprised to receive the property as an inheritance, since she rarely saw her grandmother, and the old woman had no other living relatives. It seemed like the elderly woman was extremely lonely. She shared all this with us, apparently in an attempt to avoid a negative review. Perhaps that was why we hadn't seen any bad comments about the house before renting it. After all, the host was extremely friendly, and many people seemed to want to help her. She confessed that at that moment, renting the property was her only source of income. I won't say whether or not I left a bad review. My goal is simply to share this story, which had a profound impact on me at the time. Even today, just remembering it gives me goosebumps when I think that the presence of that elderly woman is still there, trapped in the house. I spent time alone with her, and it was an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone. As for the review, well, I'll let you imagine what my decision was. What still haunts me to this day isn't just the memory of those creaking wheels or the impossible tracks in the snow. It's the fact that when I checked my phone the morning after we left, scrolling through my order history, there was no record of any food delivery that night. According to the app, I had never placed an order at all. A few years back, my girlfriend and I decided to plan a special getaway to celebrate my birthday. We were tired of the sweltering heat of Arizona summers and wanted to experience the crisp mountain air of Vermont in the fall. The autumn foliage was something neither of us had experienced before, having grown up in the desert southwest. Sarah found a quaint cabin on a vacation rental site, nestled in the woods just outside a small historic town. It looked perfect, secluded yet accessible, with all the amenities we needed. The fact that the property was managed by an elderly gentleman who had glowing reviews made Sarah feel even more confident about our choice. The owner had sent us detailed instructions via message, explaining that he couldn't meet us in person due to a family emergency out of state. This wasn't an issue for us. The directions were clear and everything seemed straightforward. He had left the key in a lockbox by the front door, with a code that would only work during our stay. When we arrived after the long drive from the airport, we were stunned by the cabin's beauty. It was far more spacious than the photos suggested. A 2-story wooden structure with large windows overlooking a creek. The interior was rustic but charming, with wooden beams across the ceiling and a stone fireplace that dominated the living room. The decoration was minimal, which didn't bother us at all. We only needed a comfortable place to rest after our daily hikes. That first night, exhausted from our travels, we fell asleep almost immediately in the downstairs bedroom. However, I woke up around 3 in the morning to an odd sound, like something being dragged across the floor above us. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Sarah was still sound asleep beside me, and I didn't want to disturb her rest. I got up to get some water, and while walking to the kitchen, I heard another noise coming from upstairs. My heart raced as I remembered we hadn't fully explored the second floor. I rushed back to check on Sarah, but she was still sleeping peacefully. I decided to investigate. The wooden staircase creaked under my weight as I made my way up. I checked the main bedroom first, empty, just as expected, and then moved to what appeared to be a study. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I returned to bed, chalking it up to the unfamiliar sounds of an old cabin settling. The next day, I chose not to mention what happened. I didn't want to create unnecessary worry that might ruin our vacation. We spent the day hiking through brilliant red and orange forests and exploring the local town's antique shops. But as we sat on a bench overlooking a covered bridge, Sarah suddenly turned to me. "I need to tell you something, but promise not to freak out," she said, her voice unusually serious. "Ever since we arrived at the cabin, I've had this strange feeling we're being watched. It hit me the moment we walked through the door. It's like there's someone else there with us." I was speechless. I asked why she hadn't told me earlier, and she explained she didn't want to ruin the trip we'd been planning for months. I suggested we find another place to stay, perhaps one of the bed and breakfasts in town. But she refused, reminding me we had already paid for 5 nights, and our budget was tight after the expensive flights. So we decided to ignore our uneasiness. That night I stayed close to her, not wanting to leave her alone even for a minute. The atmosphere in the cabin felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. And sure enough, the noises returned in the dead of night, slow, deliberate footsteps creaking across the wooden floors upstairs. I searched every room again, and like before, found nothing. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting in an armchair facing the bedroom door, trying to protect Sarah from whatever was causing those sounds. The following morning, while Sarah was showering, I heard what sounded like muffled sobbing. It seemed to be coming from somewhere close by, as if from a room adjacent to ours, which was impossible since that wall should have faced the outside of the cabin. My blood ran cold. I went to investigate the source of the sound, following it to the wall behind our bed. Theoretically, there should have been nothing but the exterior of the cabin on the other side. But as I examined the wooden paneling more carefully, I noticed small holes near the top of the wall. Being careful not to make any noise, I stood on the bed and peered through one of the holes. What I saw made my stomach drop. A small room with a worn mattress on the floor and a lamp that was turned on. I couldn't see anyone, but it was clear there was a hidden space inside the cabin structure. The most terrifying realization was that someone was living there while we were staying in the cabin. When Sarah came out of the bathroom, I signaled for her to be quiet. We hastily gathered our most important belongings and rushed out of there. Once outside, standing in the crisp morning air, I told her everything. As she listened, she began to cry, overwhelmed by fear. Realizing her instincts had been right all along, someone had indeed been watching us. We called the local sheriff, who arrived quickly with 2 deputies. I explained what I had discovered, and they entered the cabin with guns drawn. They found that the entrance to the hidden room was behind what we had thought was a locked storage closet in the hallway. Inside this secret space, they discovered a man in his early 50s with long, matted hair and a wild beard, wearing only tattered clothes. The small room contained a mattress, some canned food, and a collection of notebooks. We tried contacting the supposed property owner, but no one ever answered. Full of indignation, we reported the incident both to the police and the rental platform. That's when we learned that the man they found was actually the son of the elderly gentleman whose identity he had been using online. The father had passed away 6 months earlier, but the son had continued to rent out the cabin while secretly living in the hidden room to spy on guests. The investigation revealed that the cabin had belonged to his father, who had built the hidden room during the Cold War as a bunker. The son had been living this way for almost a year, watching at least 20 different groups of renters through those small holes. The police also found illegal surveillance equipment and evidence that he had occasionally entered the main living space while guests were sleeping or away. The man was arrested, as authorities also discovered illegal weapons and stolen property from previous guests in his hideout. The experience left us deeply traumatized. Since then, we only stay in hotels or accommodations with hundreds of verified reviews. This incident happened several years ago, and today rental platforms have implemented more rigorous security measures to prevent similar cases. Still, we learned that it's essential to always be cautious and trust your instincts. That uneasy feeling might be trying to tell you something. I still can't look at wooden walls the same way. And whenever we travel now, the first thing I do is check every inch of our room for anything unusual, a habit I doubt I'll ever break. On a foggy autumn morning during my elementary school years, I think I was in 5th grade, I was suddenly jolted awake by my father's panicked voice. This was unusual because my mom was always the one who got me ready for school. But she had left the previous evening for an emergency business trip. Dad had completely overslept, something he rarely did, since he was the one responsible for waking me that morning. It meant I had also slept far longer than I should have. There wasn't the slightest chance I'd be ready in time to catch the school bus. Classes started at 8:30, and the bus typically came around 7:45. But at that moment, it was already 7:20, and I was still in my Star Wars pajamas. I hadn't even brushed my teeth or had breakfast. Faced with this situation, Dad decided he would drive me to school himself, which would give me extra time to get ready. I was sitting at our kitchen island, still in my pajamas, hurriedly spooning cereal into my mouth, when the clock approached 7:30. That's when we heard the distinctive sound of a bus engine idling outside our house, about 15 minutes earlier than usual. Dad glanced out the window into that misty morning, gave a quick wave to signal the driver to move along, and came back inside. But the bus didn't leave. A few moments later, someone knocked firmly on our front door. Dad answered it and found himself face to face with a man dressed in what looked like a school bus driver's uniform, though something about it seemed slightly off. The color wasn't quite right, and there was no school district logo visible. The man explained that he was filling in for our regular driver, who had supposedly called in with a severe case of food poisoning. He added that he had arrived early because he wanted to get a head start, as he wasn't familiar with the route. My father responded politely that he would be driving me to school himself since we had woken up late. The man's demeanor changed subtly, almost imperceptibly, as he insisted he could wait a few minutes, mentioning that he was ahead of schedule anyway. There was something in his eyes that made my dad uneasy, though I couldn't see this from where I sat. Dad was firm but courteous, stating that I would need considerably more time to get ready, and that he should continue his route. Visibly frustrated, the man turned his back, climbed onto the bus, which I now noticed had slightly tinted windows that made it impossible to see if there were any other children inside, and drove away. I continued eating my breakfast without any sense of urgency, still not motivated to rush and get dressed. At exactly 7:45, another bus stopped in front of our house. Dad, finding this extremely strange, went outside to speak with the driver. When he returned, his face had drained of all color, but he tried to hide his reaction from me. He simply asked me to finish eating and go get dressed right away. I didn't understand what had happened then, but years later, he shared the full story with me. The second bus was driven by Mr. Thompson, our regular driver for the past 3 years, and it was filled with the usual group of neighborhood kids who rode the same route with me every day. Dad, confused and increasingly concerned, asked him about the substitute and mentioned that he had supposedly called in sick with food poisoning. Sick? I haven't missed a single day this semester, and I definitely didn't call anybody Mr. Thompson replied, his expression changing from confusion to alarm. There isn't any substitute driver assigned to this route. The district requires at least 24 hours notice for any route changes. From that point on, Mr. Thompson became visibly distressed. He immediately radioed the school transportation office while instructing my father to go back inside the house and call the police, which is exactly what Dad did, without telling me anything at the time to avoid scaring me. Later that day, after the police had come and gone, Dad picked me up from school himself. In the following weeks, we found out that there was no record of any substitute driver being being assigned to our route. The school district confirmed that all their drivers had proper identification with the district logo clearly visible on their uniforms. More disturbing was the discovery that 2 children had gone missing from neighboring towns in the previous month. In both cases, the children had reportedly been seen getting into vehicles that witnesses described as school bus yellow, but weren't actual school buses. If Dad hadn't overslept that morning, if Mom hadn't been away on that business trip, forcing Dad to handle the morning routine he wasn't accustomed to, I might never have made it to school or back home that day. Sometimes, what seems like a mishap turns out to be a blessing in disguise. The police never found the man or his bus, despite setting up checkpoints and reviewing security camera footage from across the county. I've often wondered how many other children might have encountered that same fake driver on other routes, and whether they all had someone looking out for them like I did. It happened during my sophomore year of high school. My name is Ethan, and the town where I lived was small and honestly felt stuck in time compared to other places. Surrounded by vast stretches of desert and rocky formations, the buildings were scattered far apart from one another. My house stood isolated right in the middle of nowhere, a lonely structure against the golden landscape. My parents owned a considerable plot of land, and my father, along with my grandfather, had built the house where we lived with their own hands. There was no paved road or official entrance, just a dirt path winding through the desert scrub. Because of our isolation, school buses never stopped near our house. To catch public transportation, I had to walk nearly 3/4 of a mile to a friend's house, or I could make the entire journey to school on foot. Most days, I chose to walk the whole way. On a day that seemed to start like any other, I was making my way down the path from our house, enjoying the quiet sounds of the desert morning, the gentle rustling of tumbleweeds and distant coyote calls fading with the sunrise. That's when I noticed a truck parked further ahead. It wasn't my parents' vehicle or anyone I recognized. The truck was simply stationed on the path that led exclusively to our house, something extremely unusual. To be completely honest, I had never seen an unfamiliar vehicle there before. The sight made me uncomfortable, knowing I would have to pass close by. Inside the truck sat a woman who appeared to be in her 40s, maybe even 50. She had deep, hollow circles under her eyes, and her sandy blonde hair was completely disheveled. She looked directly at me, but I averted my gaze and continued walking. I could feel her eyes following me as I passed. I quickened my pace until I reached school. That evening during dinner, I told my parents what had happened, asking who the woman might be and why she would be there. They became visibly concerned, though they tried to appear calm. They suggested that the woman was probably lost and told me not to think about it anymore, but I could sense the uneasiness in their eyes. During the following week, they began driving me to school, something unusual since both of them started work before 6 in the morning. They probably arrived late every day just to accompany me, which I thought was excessive, but I knew they were being protective. The next Monday, I went back to walking to school. During the week my parents had been driving me, there had been no sign of either the woman or the truck, so the incident seemed resolved. However, when I reached the same spot on the path, There she was again in the same place, sitting in her truck, watching me. My heart raced. It was too much of a coincidence for her to appear at exactly that spot twice, always when I was alone. Without thinking much, I decided to leave the path and cut through the desert brush. As soon as I took my first steps off the trail, I noticed that she had spotted me. She started the truck and moved forward, stopping even closer to where I was. I continued pretending to be calm, but quickened my pace, heading deeper into the scrubland. That's when I heard the truck door open and footsteps on the dry ground behind me. She called my name with a strangely soft, almost affectionate voice. I looked back for a moment. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and lifeless, her expression vacant. A disturbing sight. I ran as fast as I could. After getting far enough away and losing sight of her, I circled back through the desert terrain until I reached home. As soon as I got inside, I called my parents. They contacted the police and returned home immediately. What I could never have imagined was that my parents already knew exactly who this woman was. She had been married to my father almost 20 years ago. Apparently, she had been struggling with serious mental health issues for some time and had concerning episodes where she developed obsessions and exhibited strange and frightening behavior. On the very day I mentioned seeing her, my parents had contacted the police, certain it was her. The police searched for her, but at that moment found nothing suspicious. Nevertheless, throughout that entire week, she had been lurking around our house, aware that my parents left early for work and that I would be making the journey to school alone. To this day, my parents have never told me what happened to her afterward, nor what her intentions were with me, or what motivated her to act that way. There was something in their silence that suggested there was more to the story than they were willing to share. Perhaps a darker history between them and this woman that preceded even my birth. Sometimes I wonder if she's still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. The desert is vast, and there are many places for someone to hide, especially someone who knows exactly where to find you. I truly hope nothing like this ever happens again. But sometimes when I'm home visiting my parents, I catch myself scanning the horizon, looking for that same truck parked in the distance. Back in 2017, I was working at a small gas station on the outskirts of Denver. I mostly pulled night shifts because the pay was better, and it helped fund my graduate studies. I lived alone in a small studio apartment about 15 minutes away from work, in one of those older buildings with thin walls and creaky floors. The gas station had its fair share of regular customers who appeared at almost clockwork-like intervals. One of them was a man who came twice a week, always just before closing time. Nobody knew his name, but everyone recognized him. He was the type of customer who showed up in the final minutes before closing and irritated the staff with his timing. Since I was usually the only cashier at that hour, I was the one who dealt with him. The man had a peculiar way about him. He spoke very little, carried a weary expression, and always seemed mentally elsewhere. He wore the same faded blue jacket regardless of the weather, and drove an older model silver Buick. One night in late October, as usual, he appeared right before we closed. He bought his typical items, a pack of cigarettes, a large black coffee, and a newspaper. He paid without much interaction, and left with only a quiet good night exchanged between us. After he left, I finished my shift, cleaned up, clocked out at 11:20, and headed to the parking lot. That's when I noticed something unsettling. He was still there, standing motionless beside his car, hands hanging lifelessly at his sides, staring fixedly at the gas station's facade. Something about his stillness made my skin crawl. I quickly got into my car and drove home, checking my rearview mirror more often than usual. The following day I was off work and took advantage of it to catch up on some sleep. I didn't go to bed until after 1 in the morning. Just as I settled under the covers, a bright light swept across my bedroom window. I assumed it was just a neighbor arriving home with their car headlights beaming in, so I paid it no mind. Within seconds, the light disappeared, and I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I couldn't tell if it had been minutes or hours. I woke up startled by what I thought was my phone ringing. Still disoriented, I fumbled around my nightstand, but found no missed calls or messages. I was ready to ignore it and go back to sleep when something caught my attention. My bedroom door was slightly ajar. This was strange because I always made a point of closing it completely before going to bed, a habit I'd developed since childhood. I got up, went to the door, and pushed it to check if there was something wrong with it. It closed normally, fitting into the frame without any difficulty. Nervousness began to take hold of me. Even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, my mind went back to that light I had seen before falling asleep. I went to the window and peered through the blinds. There was a car parked in my driveway. Only the back of the vehicle was visible in the darkness, but I recognized the distinctive taillights of a Buick. Fear gripped me. Was someone inside my apartment? I rushed back to the bedroom door and turned on the light, paralyzed, thinking about what to do next. I decided I should call the police, but when I looked at the nightstand where I had left my phone, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. An eye was watching me through the small gap in my closet door. The shock was instantaneous. My body froze, and a strangled cry escaped my throat. Without thinking twice, I bolted out of the apartment and down the stairs. It took me nearly 20 minutes to find a neighbor willing to open their door at that hour and call the police for me. When the officers arrived, the car was still parked in my driveway, but they initially found no one. After searching the surrounding area, they located a man hiding in the bushes behind my building. My stomach turned when I recognized the gas station customer. The officers found a small notebook in his pocket filled with details about my daily routine, when I left for work, when I returned, which lights I turned on in which order, and even what I typically ate for dinner based on the trash I threw out. The explanations he gave were disconnected and bizarre, but it became evident that he had been watching me for months. In his car, they found duct tape, rope, a hunting knife, and several empty syringes. The police later told me he had a history of similar behavior in another state, but had moved before charges were filed. I learned that he had been following me home occasionally after my shifts, parking a block away and watching my apartment. That night, he had finally decided to act. The only reason I woke up was because his burner phone had vibrated while he was hiding in my closet, his accomplice calling to ask what was taking so long. A week later, I quit my job at the gas station and moved to a more secure apartment building with controlled access. I also started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma. Even though it's been years, I still check my closets before going to bed and always make sure my doors and windows are locked. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if his phone hadn't vibrated at that exact moment, or if I hadn't noticed my bedroom door was open. Those small details probably saved my life, but thinking about what could have happened still keeps me awake some nights. I still get chills thinking about what my wife and I experienced during what was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. This happened about 5 years ago, shortly after we got married. We were eager to celebrate our new life together and decided to take a trip to a small coastal town in Maine. My wife found this beautiful lakeside cabin through one of those vacation rental websites. The price was surprisingly reasonable for such a picturesque place, especially considering it was nestled in a quiet cove with private access to the lake and its own small dock. The photos showed a charming wooden structure with large windows overlooking the serene waters, surrounded by towering pine trees. When we arrived, everything seemed even more perfect than the pictures had suggested. The cabin was rustic yet comfortable, with a stone fireplace, wooden beams crossing the ceiling, and a large deck that wrapped around to face the water. Our host, Eleanor, was incredibly welcoming. She greeted us with freshly baked cookies and spent nearly an hour pointing out local attractions on a hand-drawn map she'd prepared for guests. During the day, we explored the area, hiking through forest trails and taking a small boat out on the lake. Everything was peaceful and exactly what we had hoped for in our getaway. But that tranquility was shattered during our first night. My wife has always struggled with insomnia, so while I fell asleep almost immediately after our heads hit the pillows, she stayed up reading by the soft glow of her book light. Around 2 a.m, she gently shook me awake, her face tense with concern. "I keep hearing splashing sounds coming from the lake," she whispered. From our bedroom, there was a large bay window that provided a clear view of the dock and part of the lake. She'd already gotten up to look twice, but hadn't seen anything unusual. Still, she was certain she'd heard what sounded like someone swimming. I told her to stay in bed while I checked things out. Grabbing my phone for its flashlight, I made my way through the living room and out onto the deck. The night was unnaturally still. No wind, no animal sounds, just an eerie silence hanging over the lake. I swept my light across the water's surface, but saw nothing unusual. Thinking it might have been a fish jumping or perhaps a loon, I returned to bed and assured my wife it was probably just wildlife. We had barely settled back under the covers when a loud splash echoed from outside. So distinct there was no mistaking it. Before I could even say anything, my wife gave me a look that clearly said, "Now do you believe me?" I jumped up and rushed to the window. Though I couldn't see anyone in the water, the lake's surface was rippling unnaturally, creating concentric circles as if someone had just disturbed it. What made it especially unsettling was the complete absence of wind or any other explanation for the water's movement. My wife, now visibly frightened, insisted I shouldn't go outside again. Instead, she sent a message to Eleanor explaining the situation, though we didn't expect a response given the late hour. We spent the rest of the night on edge, but after that incident, everything went quiet. By morning, the whole experience had taken on a dreamlike quality, and I almost convinced myself we'd imagined it all. Checking her phone, my wife found a message from a leaner apologizing for not responding sooner. She explained that she takes strong sleeping medication and hadn't heard the notification. We decided not to make a big deal about it. After all, we had no proof of anything unusual. Later that afternoon, a leaner stopped by to check on us. She seemed genuinely concerned and apologetic, mentioning that she had reviewed the security camera footage, but hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. Her reaction was so sincere that we felt bad for causing worry. We suggested it might have just been local wildlife, though privately, neither of us was convinced. The day passed pleasantly enough. We visited a small maritime museum in town, had lunch at a quaint seafood shack on the harbor, and took a leisurely drive along the coast, admiring the rocky shoreline and historic lighthouses. By the time we returned to the cabin, we were exhausted. My wife headed straight for the shower, while I stretched out on the bed, scrolling through the photos we'd taken that day. That's when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of splashing water from the lake. This time I didn't hesitate. Moving quickly but quietly, I went to the window and peered out. Just as before, the lake's surface was disturbed, ripples expanding outward as if someone had just emerged from or submerged into the water. Determined to solve the mystery, I decided not to tell my wife and instead crept downstairs while she was still in the shower. As I approached the sliding glass door that led to the deck, what I saw made my blood run cold. There on the glass were small, wet handprints, unmistakably those of a child, and water dripping down as if someone soaking wet had pressed against it. The prints were fresh, water still beating and running down the glass. I raced back upstairs, unable to hide my panic. My wife, now wrapped in a towel, immediately asked what was wrong. I couldn't lie. My face had already given me away. I told her everything, and despite her initial reluctance, she insisted on seeing for herself. When we went back downstairs together, the handprints were still there, small and distinct against the glass. When we turned on the exterior lights, we could see wet footprints leading from the lake to the door, tiny footprints that could only belong to a child. Something felt deeply wrong, even dangerous. I searched the entire property, but found no one. By this point, my wife had called a leaner, who answered immediately and promised to come right over. Within 15 minutes, a leaner arrived, looking disheveled and anxious. Without saying much, she showed us the security footage on her tablet. What we saw defied explanation, the water moving on its own, and then, most chillingly, those small handprints appearing on the glass as if pressed by invisible hands. A leaner broke down then, collapsing into one of the dining chairs. Through tears, she revealed the truth she had been hiding. 7 years ago, she had lived in this cabin with her husband and their 6-year-old son, Timothy. One autumn afternoon, while a leaner was inside preparing dinner, Timothy was playing on the dock. She had only turned her back for what felt like minutes, but when she looked out the window to check on him, the dock was empty. By the time they found him in the lake, it was too late. Alina and her husband had moved away after the tragedy, unable to face the memories. Years later, after her divorce, she had returned and converted the property into a vacation rental. Unable to sell it, but also unable to live there herself. She managed it from her new home in town, only coming by when necessary. "I should have told you," she sobbed, "but I was afraid no one would stay here if they knew. Some guests have mentioned strange sounds near the lake, but nothing like this has ever happened before." Alina offered to refund our entire stay if we wanted to leave, but we could see how distraught she was. We declined the refund out of compassion for her situation, but there was no way we could spend another night in that cabin. Within an hour, we had packed our belongings and were on the road, looking for a hotel in the nearest town. As we drove away in the darkness, headlights cutting through the mist rising off the lake, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin one last time. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a small figure standing at the end of the dock, watching us leave. Then the trees obscured my view, and we turned onto the main road, carrying with us an experience that would haunt our memories forever. I was 42 years old when everything began. Until then, my life had followed a steady rhythm, without major excitements or scares. My name is Raymond, and I work as an appliance technician specializing in HVAC systems. I've been working since my teenage years, experiencing ups and downs, but nothing that ever knocked me off course. I've always been the type who prefers fixing things rather than buying new ones. My routine had been shaped by loyal customers, emergency service calls, and occasional lunch breaks at simple diners around town. It wasn't a luxurious life, but I took pride in every machine I brought back to life. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Northern Virginia, where every house had a small yard and low fences that kept the neighborhood visible. My house barely had a gate. I enjoyed watching people move along the sidewalk. One foggy Tuesday morning in October, I received a call from a medical clinic located in a historic district of the city. They said their heating system had been having problems for weeks, and other technicians hadn't been able to resolve the issue. I was accustomed to these types of calls, so I didn't suspect anything unusual. Upon arrival, I greeted the receptionist who explained the details. She then led me to the clinic director, Dr. Monica Harmon, a woman in her early 40s with a firm way of speaking. She took me to the waiting room where the heating unit was malfunctioning. I noticed it was making a strange noise, as if it hadn't been maintained for months. While I opened the panel, Monica stood with her arms crossed, observing my every move. I sensed she was strict, but she explained everything politely and straightforwardly. At that moment, my only concern was discovering why the system wasn't working properly. I spent about 3 hours repairing the internal components, replacing a part, and cleaning the ductwork. During this time, Dr. Harmon checked patient files and spoke with several patients, but always glanced in my direction to see if I needed anything. When I finished, I pointed out the defect I had found and left my contact information for future maintenance. Everything proceeded professionally, but as I was leaving, I noticed she gave me a once-over, as if trying to understand more about the person standing before her. A few days later, I was called again. The heating system had started showing temperature fluctuations. It was a secondary electrical problem. This time, Monica seemed more at ease. We passed through the small clinic kitchen, where there were thermal carafes of coffee and homemade muffins. She offered me a freshly brewed cup saying it was a way of apologizing for the system's inconsistency. While we drank standing up, we began to talk about trivial matters like the unpredictable weather and the flow of patients at the clinic. The conversation flowed more naturally than I expected. I've never been the flirtatious type, but I felt a certain empathy in the air. I left knowing that she was not only a serious professional, but also someone who carried a lot of responsibility on her shoulders. At the end of the visit, we exchanged a joke or two about the difficulty of finding replacement parts. Shortly after, I decided to invite her for lunch at a well-known corner diner famous for serving loaded sandwiches that everyone loves. She hesitated. My daughter Eliza sometimes doesn't take well to me going out, and honestly, I don't usually mix personal life with work. I said it didn't need to be a formal event, just a quick meal to clear her head. She agreed, but made it clear she didn't want to become a topic of conversation at the clinic. I smiled and promised to keep everything between us. We met on a Saturday afternoon at a small diner without flashy signs. Monica arrived wearing a simple floral dress, yet she still gave me the impression of being elegant. We ordered sandwiches and fresh juice. The conversation was so light that we even forgot what had brought us together, the heating system problem. After that meeting, I mustered up courage again and invited her for a walk in a nearby park. She accepted. As we walked, we talked about our lives. I discovered she was a widow of many years, having lost her husband suddenly. She told me that her daughter Eliza was entering adolescence when it happened, and that since then, the relationship between them hadn't been easy. It was during this day that Monica mentioned a certain mental fatigue she had been feeling. I told her that if she needed any practical support, I was available. She thanked me, but always seemed hesitant when the conversation approached family topics. Even so, that walk changed something between us. We began talking every day through quick calls or text messages. She was always concerned about the clinic, and I with my repairs, but we found gaps to see each other. A month passed before she invited me to her house for the first time. She said she would make a simple dinner, and that Eliza wouldn't be there, as she was spending the weekend at a friend's house. I was excited and prepared a loaf of sourdough bread to bring. I arrived at the agreed time. Monica's house was unassuming without great luxuries, but very cozy inside. Right at the entrance, I smelled home cooking, something like a beef stew with herbs. In the middle of dinner, she became distracted and let slip that Eliza had actually agreed to leave the house because she couldn't stand me, which was strange since I had barely met the girl. Monica tried to smooth things over by saying that her daughter was going through a difficult period and that any change in family routine was already cause for conflict. I said I understood and wouldn't hold it against her. I appreciated that Monica was gradually opening up to me, even under tension. The following days were calm until, during a week of unexpected cold snaps, Monica called asking me to come to the clinic again. This time it wasn't a defect in the equipment, but the electrical installation that was fluctuating. I did the inspection, and at the end, she invited me to dinner at her house with the promise that this time Eliza would be present. It was on a Friday night. I arrived punctually with a bottle of sparkling cider in my hands. Monica greeted me enthusiastically, but when I entered, I found Eliza sitting on the couch, staring fixedly at her phone screen. She made no motion to get up. I tried to break the ice. "Hi, how are you?" "I'm Raymond." She merely raised her eyes for a second and went back to typing without a response. Monica, somewhat embarrassed, called me to the kitchen where she was finishing preparing dinner. I stayed there washing the dishes she was using and talking about trivialities until Eliza appeared in the doorway. The girl wore dark clothes, heavy makeup, and carried an expression of perpetual boredom. During dinner, she made no effort to be kind. She made harsh comments, questioning why her mother would bring someone who, in her view, added no value. Monica tried to smooth things over, saying I was a hardworking, honest person. At one point, Eliza looked at me and commented, "Are you sure it's just honesty, or are you looking for a shortcut into my mother's life?" I was speechless. Her words seemed loaded with something I couldn't define. I didn't respond. Monica was embarrassed. After dinner, the girl returned to her room, closing the door forcefully. I didn't want to extend the night, so Monica accompanied me to the exit, apologizing. I assured her everything was fine, that her daughter just had her internal issues. Even so, I began to notice a tension that hadn't existed before. Monica talked less and less about Eliza, and I didn't push when we met. She seemed relaxed, but whenever the conversation veered toward home life, a heaviness appeared in her eyes. The atmosphere really became strange when Monica called me one Sunday morning, saying that all the kitchen appliances had burned out simultaneously. I found it curious and went there with my tools. I saw the microwave, blender, and toaster, all damaged at once. I opened each appliance and noticed signs of strong short circuits, something I didn't see frequently. I pondered, could it be a power surge, or was there something wrong with the internal wiring of the house? While I was working on the appliances, Eliza appeared and stood watching. She didn't speak, just stared at me. Occasionally, she would leave, rummage through a drawer, and return to stand near me. When I finished, she asked, "Do you believe in energies that influence what happens around us?" I wasn't expecting that question. Actually, I believe we emanate good or bad things, but I'm not much into mysticism. She laughed lightly in a way that made me uncomfortable, then returned to her room. At that moment, I sensed a heavy atmosphere in the house, although I couldn't describe or prove it. I returned home with the feeling that something was out of place. A few days later, Monica and I arranged to meet again. We scheduled lunch at a simple restaurant that served home-style food at communal tables. She seemed nervous and explained that Eliza had been coming home in the early hours of the morning, always with the smell of incense in her room, and that she was collecting strange images with symbols drawn in notebooks. "She doesn't listen to me, and I don't know where I went wrong," she confided. I tried to comfort her, but words failed me. I suggested she talk to a professional, but she thought it better to wait, saying her daughter was going through a difficult phase, that it was unresolved grief and rebellion against the world. Later, she confessed that she had considered talking to the police or social workers, but had no evidence to justify such drastic measures. Nevertheless, she assured me she would try to schedule an appointment with a psychologist for Eliza. The following week, there was an event at the medical clinic, a kind of community outreach day. I went there to install new ventilation units. At the end of the day, Monica introduced me to her brother, Paul, who had come to help with volunteer care. Paul was a good-humored type. I saw nothing strange in him. We talked about football, car mechanics, trivial things. He seemed very receptive. Shortly after, I also met Monica's mother, Mrs. Aliner, an elderly woman with white hair, who maintained a look of constant concern. She smiled when Monica introduced us, but soon began questioning about her granddaughter, saying something like, "That girl needs boundaries, otherwise she drags everyone into the same hole." That raised an alarm for me, but I didn't probe deeper. Perhaps it was just a grandmother's frustration. The situation began to get more serious when, on a rainy Saturday, Monica called me at night. Her voice was trembling. She said Eliza had left the house without saying where she was going and wasn't answering her phone. I asked if she needed help looking for her, but she preferred that I just come over to keep her company. I got in my car and went immediately. On the way, I saw that the streets were almost empty. The rain was falling relentlessly. I arrived and found Monica dejected, sitting on the sofa, turning a cup of tea in her hands. I sat beside her, trying to provide some comfort. Around midnight, Eliza entered without making noise, leaving the door half open. She noticed my presence, but acted as if I were just another piece of furniture in the room. When Monica tried to speak, the girl interrupted her. "Are you afraid, or do you think I'm doing something wrong?" Monica asked where she had been. Without responding directly, Eliza went to her room and left the door ajar. Nothing more was heard. I left shortly after, concerned about the situation but not knowing how to help. In the following days, I began having headaches and unusual fatigue. I thought it was excessive work, but at home, nothing energized me. During the nights, I started having confused dreams in which a female figure appeared that I couldn't see clearly. But that left me with a racing heart upon awakening. This repeated for several nights. On a Wednesday, I had to miss work due to fever and nausea. I woke up at 11 in the morning, and when I checked my phone, I saw messages from Monica. She spoke of lights flickering inside the house, of appliances that wouldn't work again even after being repaired. I reported my symptoms, and she commented that she too had been feeling weak, sleeping poorly, and experiencing severe migraines. According to her, she had already lost several pounds without explanation. On one of the nights when I couldn't sleep, I received a call from an old work colleague, Jake, who also did electrical maintenance, but dedicated himself to studies of alternative medicine and folk beliefs. He said he had heard through another friend that I wasn't well and wanted to offer help. After hearing a general description of my problems, Jake talked about a man who lived in a remote farm and performed blessings. He wasn't a famous healer or shaman, just someone who worked with herbs and simple prayers. A few days later, I took courage and went to this farm, which was about an hour's drive from the city. The place was rustic, without electricity. I was received by an older gentleman in a straw hat who invited me to sit on a wooden stool while he heated water on a wood stove. He asked me what I was feeling. Without ceremony, I spoke of the malaise, the insomnia, the strange episodes at the home of someone close to me. He looked at me attentively, asked me to close my eyes and try to concentrate on my breathing. Then the man passed a branch of herbs around my body, murmuring prayers I couldn't identify. When he finished, he commented something that left me unsettled. "You're accompanied by a shadow that isn't yours," I questioned him, but he didn't go into details. He only said for me to be careful when returning to Monica's house, as there seemed to be a source of confused energy there, capable of influencing those nearby. He didn't mention witchcraft or anything like that, but made it clear that there were greater forces at work. I returned to the city full of doubts. Monica invited me to dinner on Friday. I was reluctant to accept, but agreed, because I wanted to see how she was doing. When I arrived, I noticed that Eliza wasn't home. Monica said her daughter had traveled with a friend. She seemed relieved. During dinner, I noticed that the lights did indeed flicker from time to time, without apparent reason. The television would turn on, but the image would disappear. The refrigerator had cooling problems, as if the energy was fluctuating. At the end of the night, Monica and I talked for hours until she fell asleep on the sofa. I went to Eliza's room to see if I could find any clue that would explain everything. The door was closed. I touched the doorknob and for a moment thought about giving up, but I entered. The environment was dark, with few things visible. A smell of incense still lingered in the air. On the desk, there was a notebook with some symbols drawn, something that resembled human figures tied by lines. I closed it quickly. When I turned to leave, I felt something strange on my left shoulder, as if someone had touched me, but there was no one there. I thought it was just accumulated tension. I returned to the living room. Monica was sleeping deeply. I left a note saying I had gone home and left. In the following days, I received some anonymous messages on my cell phone talking about invocations and ancient rituals. They seemed like veiled threats. I suspected Eliza, as the number was unknown, but the writing style was full of abbreviations, reminiscent of how teenagers write on social media. I didn't respond. I blocked the number, but new ones appeared. Messages continued to arrive, saying that this was just the beginning. My health worsened. I began to lose a lot of weight. I couldn't concentrate. In the early hours, I would wake up confused, sweating, and sometimes had the impression that someone had been inside my house. Objects changed places. Light bulbs burned out more frequently than normal. Jake, my colleague, noticed I was different and referred me to another person, a faith healer named Mrs. Sarah, who lived in the oldest part of the region. I went there on a Sunday afternoon. I found a gentle-voiced lady who opened the door carefully. She asked my name and requested that I describe everything from the beginning. As I spoke, she lit white candles and sprinkled scented water in the environment. In the end, she said my case wasn't common, that perhaps Monica's daughter was doing some kind of binding, but not the type seen in books of love spells. It seemed aimed at controlling will, creating dependency, and weakening vital energy. I asked if there was a way to reverse it. She commented that yes, but it required, among other things, a complete cut of contact. She also warned me that if the other person had more powerful allies, it would be necessary to reinforce prayers and protection rituals. I left there thoughtful, not knowing how to break the news to Monica. 2 days later, I tried to call her, but the phone was out of service. The medical clinic informed me that she had taken a leave of absence. I went to her house to see if everything was okay. When I knocked, Eliza answered. She opened the door just enough to show half her face. She wouldn't let me in, saying only, "My mother doesn't want to talk to you," and closed the door. I returned home worried. That night I received another message containing a photo of me getting out of the car in front of Monica's house. Below the photo was a phrase saying, "You can try to escape, but you're already marked." My fatigue reached another level. I could barely eat. I had minor dizzy spells during work. 3 days later, I was hospitalized for an evaluation because I fainted in the middle of a repair. The tests indicated exhaustion and decreased immunity. I stayed in the hospital for a day and a half. No doctor found a specific cause beyond chronic stress. Leaving the hospital, I thought about distancing myself definitively from Monica, but deep down I felt guilty. I thought her situation would only worsen without having someone nearby. So I decided to leave a letter in her mailbox, asking her to call me when she could. The next day, the letter was in the same place, but torn in half. However, I found a note attached to the gate. "Stop insisting. You haven't understood your place." There was no signature, but I suspected who it was from. From then on, I began having auditory hallucinations. Sometimes in the silence of late afternoon, I got the impression of hearing someone calling my name. Other times, it was as if someone was laughing near me. I considered moving to another city. That's when Paul, Monica's brother, called me. He said he was worried about his sister, that the house seemed uninhabitable. Inside, the lights were burning out, and Monica wouldn't let anyone enter anymore. He affirmed that Eliza had locked certain rooms, and that even the doctors had distanced themselves, because Monica refused to leave for new consultations. Paul mentioned even a priest, a friend of the family, who had tried to visit Monica, but she didn't answer and asked him to leave. He asked if I knew of anything that might be happening. I didn't know what to respond. He asked me to help convince Monica to go to his mother's house, but I didn't have the courage to go back there. To try to find peace, I sought the faith healer again. She gave me a talisman and told me not to remove it from my neck. She also taught me a simple ritual with water and coarse salt. I did as she instructed. I spread coarse salt in the corners of the house. I prayed on my knees in the bedroom, asking for protection from forces I didn't know. In the first nights, I thought it was working. I slept better without as many disturbances. One day, I decided to pass by Monica's house. It looked abandoned. The gate was ajar, the garden overrun with weeds. I called, but no one answered. I left because I feared encountering Eliza. That night, I received a call from a number I didn't know. When I answered, I heard a measured young voice. "You think you can solve everything with salt and prayers." I recognized the tone, even though it was distorted. It was Eliza. I hung up immediately and felt weaker than ever. I woke up the next day with a scratch on my left shoulder, even though I was alone in the house. I felt a chill inside upon realizing that even there, in my bedroom, I wasn't safe. I went to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about Monica. I ended up seeking news from colleagues at the medical clinic, who told me she had presented a medical certificate and hadn't appeared for more than 2 weeks. I tried to contact her once more without success. I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. One sleepless night, I received a message on my cell phone. An unknown number again. It read, "The link was made. You only leave if I allow." That was the point where I realized I didn't have the strength to fight alone. It was then that Paul called me again, asking if we could go together to see Monica. I didn't want to refuse, so on a Saturday morning, we gathered courage and went to her house. We called, knocked on the door, nothing. Paul, worried, broke down the door. Inside, the living room was in shadows, with the curtains closed. There was a strong smell of incense, but also of mold and something I couldn't identify. We found Monica lying on the sofa, drowsy, and with the appearance of someone who hadn't slept for days. She opened her eyes slowly, recognized us, and murmured for us to leave. Paul insisted, saying we needed to take her to a hospital. She denied, "I just need to rest." It was evident she was debilitated. While Paul tried to convince her, I risked going up to Eliza's room. The door was wide open, and the room empty. There were no clothes, books, or any sign that someone lived there. On the bed, I saw a wooden box with symbols scratched on the lid. I opened it on impulse, but didn't understand what was inside. Objects tied by threads, small cloth dolls with faces painted black. When I returned to the living room, Monica was completely apathetic. I tried to ask where her daughter was, but she just shook her head with half-closed eyes. Paul called their mother, who promised to come immediately. We went outside to wait. In a few minutes, Mrs. Alina arrived by taxi. She entered the house but came out quickly, saying, "I can't stay in there. It feels like something is pushing me out." It was at that hour that she decided to call again the priest known to the family. The man arrived in the late afternoon, talked with us, but couldn't do much without Monica's authorization. He still tried to talk to her, but upon realizing there would be no permission for a more extensive rite, he retreated with a disturbed face. The situation became an impasse. The mother and brother didn't know where Eliza was. Monica wasn't responding to questions, and I no longer had the emotional structure to continue in that place. I returned home and spent the night awake. In the middle of the night, around 2 o'clock, I heard a noise in the yard. I went to check, nothing, but hanging on the knob of the back door was a braided cord with red and black threads. It seemed wet with something. I was so disturbed that I didn't even want to touch it. The next morning, I informed my boss that I would be away for an indefinite period. I took my things and traveled to a more remote location where I had distant relatives. I spent about 10 days there, resting and trying to recover. The nightmares continued, but with less intensity. I thought the physical distance could break the connection. I returned to the city, only to organize my bills and plan a definitive move. On the first night at home, I found a cloth bag hanging on the door with a note. "It's not like that you leave." There was no signature, but I suspected who it was from. From then on, I began packing my bags, determined to leave behind any memory of that troubled period. In the midst of the mess, I opened the wardrobe and in a corner found a paper with various stains, as if it were smudged ink. I recognized parts of symbols similar to those I had seen in Eliza's notebook. I never knew how that paper got there. I threw everything away immediately. The next day, I left before dawn when most people were still sleeping. I didn't tell anyone until the moment I closed the gate. I imagined she might appear on the street, standing, watching me, but she didn't appear. I left without looking back, driving until the sun rose, with my head confused. Today, it's been almost a year since these events. I live in another region, with a job that doesn't involve so many external visits. Every now and then, I dream that I'm in a dark house looking for someone who isn't there. In some of these dreams, Eliza appears in the hallway, but doesn't speak. She just extends a braided red thread to me. I wake up sweating, not knowing if it was all just in my head or if something still accompanies me. I never saw Monica again, nor had concrete news of Eliza. Sometimes I blame myself for not being able to help them. Other times, I think it was the only possible choice to maintain my sanity. I still carry the talisman that misses. Sarah gave me, out of precaution or superstition. Perhaps I'll never know the truth. What I do know is that each day I try to convince myself that certain things are left behind. But deep down, I'm not so sure if this chapter has truly been closed. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.